The little girl's bare feet hit the hot ground first, and then her knees followed. She was 4 years old, wearing a dress so torn and thin it barely covered her shoulders. In her arms, she held a baby boy, maybe 6 weeks old. His tiny face was slack, his lips cracked white from thirst. He hadn't cried in hours. That was the worst part. She knew babies cried. But this one had gone quiet, and the quiet was worse than any scream. She wasn't crying anymore herself. She was past that. She just held out one small hand to every pair of boots that walked by and said the only word she had left. "Water, please, for my brother." Nobody stopped. Before we go any further into Clara Dunn's story, I want to ask you something from the bottom of my heart. If you believe a child should never be thrown away, hit that subscribe button right now. And tell me what city you're watching from today. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The market at Caldwell Flats ran 6 days a week, and on the 7th, God rested. But the merchants didn't. They opened their stalls before sunrise and closed them at dusk. In between, they sold flour and rope and saddle leather and dried beans to every dust-covered soul who rode or walked through the valley. It was a loud, crowded, unapologetic stretch of commerce, and nobody had much patience for interruption, least of all for a child. Clara Dunn had been walking since before sunup. She didn't know how far she'd come. 4-year-olds don't measure distance in miles, they measure it in pain, and her feet had stopped hurting sometime around mid-morning, when the feeling in her toes simply quit. She'd shifted Benjamin from one arm to the other so many times that both shoulders ached deep into the bone. But she didn't put him down. She hadn't put him down once since she'd picked him up from the blanket where their mama had left them 2 days ago and never came back. Benjamin was 6 weeks old. He hadn't cried in hours. That was the part that scared her most. She knew babies cried. Even at 4, she knew that much. Benjamin had cried every night of his short life, loud and hungry, absolutely certain the world owed him something. But now he just lay against her chest, his head heavy on her shoulder, his breath coming in shallow little pulls that she could barely feel. "Please," she said to the first pair of boots she reached. A man in a brown vest counting coins at a dry goods stall. "Please, mister, my brother needs water." The man looked down, looked at her, looked back at his coins. "Move along, girl." She didn't move. "He's real little. He ain't drunk nothing since yesterday." "Ain't my problem." He turned his back. "Go on, you're blocking the walk." She went to the next stall. A woman with gray hair and a hard face selling bolts of cloth. "Ma'am, please, just a little water for my brother." "You got money?" "No, ma'am." "Then I ain't got water. This ain't a charity house." The woman snapped a bolt of fabric flat on the table and didn't look up again. Clara kept moving. She went to 7 more stalls in a row. She tried every word she knew that might make grown people stop. "Please, sir, ma'am, brother, dying." And every single person either turned away, told her to move, or acted as if she were made of air. One man laughed. She didn't understand why. She wasn't doing anything funny. By the time she reached the middle of the market, her legs had started to shake. She sat down on the edge of the boardwalk just for a second, just to rest. And the second she did, her knees buckled the rest of the way, and she went down hard, catching herself on her free palm against the rough-hewn wood. Benjamin made a small sound, not quite a cry, just a breath with a little complaint wrapped in it. She pulled him tighter. "Okay," she whispered to him. "Okay, Benny, I got you." She didn't know if she did. She was still sitting there, still holding him, still pressing her forehead against his, and feeling how dry and hot his little face was, when she heard the boots. Different from the others. Slower, heavier. And they stopped. She looked up. The man standing over her was tall. She couldn't have said how tall, because from down on the boardwalk, everything looked tall. But there was something about the way he stood that wasn't like the other men. He wasn't walking past her. He wasn't looking over her head. He was looking straight at her, and his hat was pushed back just enough that she could see his eyes. Dark, tired, but not unkind. "You all right, little miss?" She didn't answer right away. She'd learned in the past 2 days that questions from adults weren't always questions. Sometimes they were just a way to get you to talk before they told you to get lost. "How old are you?" he asked. "4," she said, "and the baby's 6 weeks." She shifted Benjamin so the man could see his face. "He ain't ate nothing. I tried to get water, but they kept saying no." The man crouched down. Not because he had to. He could have talked to her just fine from up there. But he crouched down so his face was closer to level with hers. And she didn't know why that made her throat go tight, but it did. "Where's your mama?" he asked. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "She went somewhere," she said carefully. "2 days ago. She said she'd be back." The man's jaw moved. He looked at Benjamin. He looked back at her. "She ain't coming back," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Clara didn't say anything. He stood up slow, looked around at the market, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a few coins, and walked straight to the nearest water barrel. The one sitting in front of the hardware store that had a tin cup hanging on a nail beside it. He dropped the coins into the merchant's hand without a word. The merchant looked at the coins, looked at the man, didn't argue. The man brought the cup back and held it down to her. "Drink first," he said. "Then we'll get something for the baby." Clara stared at the cup. "Go on," he said. "It's clean." She drank. The water was warm and tasted faintly of tin, and it was the best thing she'd ever put in her mouth in her entire 4 years of life. She drank half of it, then stopped herself, even though every part of her wanted to drain it, because Benny needed some too. "How do I give it to him?" she asked. "He can't hold a cup." "No," the man agreed. He sat down on the edge of the boardwalk beside her, right there in the middle of the market in the dust, without seeming to care one bit who saw him. And he tore a small strip from the inside of his shirt cuff and twisted it into a thin wick. "Dip this in the water. Let him suck on it. Slow. Don't rush it." She watched him show her. Benjamin took to it immediately. Those tiny cracked lips working against the wet cloth, his little fingers clutching at nothing. "More," Clara said. "Slow," the man said again. "Too fast and he'll be sick. Slow and steady." She did it slow. 3 times, then 4, dipping and offering, watching Benjamin's color change. Just the smallest amount, just enough to know the water was reaching him. "My name's Jack Harper," the man said while she worked. "I got a ranch about 4 miles east of here. My boy Eli's there. He's 10. He paused. "What's your name?" "Clara." "Clara what?" She thought about it. "Clara Dunn, and the baby's Benjamin, but I call him Benny." Jack looked at the baby for a moment. "He's a fighter. He's real little," she said for the 3rd time that hour, because it was the thing that scared her most. He was so small. Too small to do anything for himself. Too small to tell her if something was wrong. She had to guess always, and she was 4 years old, and she didn't know how to guess about babies. "He is little," Jack agreed, "but he's breathing, and he's eating. That counts for something." He looked at her. "You got any other family, Clara? Anybody at all?" She shook her head. "No aunts or uncles? No neighbors who knew your mama?" "Mama didn't like people much," she said simply. "We moved a lot." Jack was quiet for a moment. Around them, the market kept going. Boots on boards, voices over prices, wagon wheels grinding past. And not one single person who passed them looked over. A man sitting with 2 orphan children in the middle of the boardwalk, and the whole town kept walking like they were furniture. Jack noticed. She could see it in the way his eyes moved. "Come on," he said, and stood and held out his hand. "Let's get you something to eat." She didn't take his hand right away. He didn't push. He just stood there, patient, hand open, waiting. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Right now, just to the end of the street, where old May Sutton runs a cook stall. She does bean soup and cornbread." He paused. "And you look like you could use both. After that, we can figure the rest." Clara looked at his hand, looked at his face. She was 4 years old, and she had been failed in the past 2 days by every single adult she'd encountered. She had no particular reason to trust this one. But she also had a 6-week-old baby brother, and no food, and no water, and nowhere to go. And her legs were still shaking. And this man had bought her water without being asked, and had sat down in the dirt beside her without making her feel small. She took his hand. He helped her up, steadied her when her knees wobbled, and walked with her at her pace, slow, because that was the only speed she had left, to the far end of the market, where a stout woman with flour on her apron was ladling soup into tin bowls. "May," Jack said. The woman looked up, looked at the children, and her expression shifted. "Lord in heaven," she said softly. "2 bowls," Jack said, "and whatever you got that'll work for a nursing baby. He's too little for solids." May was already moving. She came around her table and bent down to Clara's level, not touching her, just looking at her face with an expression that was somewhere between sorrow and fury. "How long since you ate, sweetheart?" "Yesterday," Clara said. "I had some bread a man dropped." May straightened up and turned to Jack. "Yesterday," she repeated in a voice that was very quiet and very controlled. "I know," he said. "And nobody—" She stopped herself, pressed her lips together. "You sit right here," she told Clara. "Right on this bench, and you hold that baby, and you don't move, and I'm going to bring you the best bowl of soup in Caldwell Flats." Clara sat. Benjamin had gone quiet again, but a different kind of quiet this time. Not the frightening stillness of before, but something more like rest. His lips were wet. His fingers had uncurled. May brought soup, thick with beans, and a chunk of cornbread the size of Clara's fist. She sat down beside her and helped her eat it, because Clara's hands were shaking too badly to manage the spoon properly. And nobody said a word about that. Jack sat across from them, his hat on the bench beside him, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee May had pressed on him without asking. He watched Clara eat. He watched Benjamin sleep. His face was hard to read, weathered, still, the kind of face that had been outside in all weather for many years. But his eyes were something else. Careful, thinking. "Jack," May said quietly over Clara's head, "I know. You can't just— I know what I can and can't do, May. That baby needs a wet nurse at minimum, and Clara needs— I know." He set down his coffee. "I'm working on it." May looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Clara, who had slowed down on the soup because her stomach, shrunken from 2 days of nothing, was already starting to protest the sudden generosity. "Easy," May murmured. "Slow down. There's more if you want it. All you want." "I can have more?" Clara asked. Something crossed May's face. "Yes, baby. All you want." Clara ate about half the bowl, decided the rest of her body was not going to cooperate with her ambitions, and sat back with Benjamin against her shoulder. She looked at Jack. "You got a wife?" she asked. The question landed differently than she'd intended. She could tell because something changed in his face. Not dramatically, he was too controlled for that, but something shifted behind the eyes. "Not anymore," he said. "She died 3 years ago." Clara absorbed this. "My mama might be dead too," she said. "I don't know. She just didn't come back." "I know," Jack said for the 3rd time, but this time it sounded different. Less like an acknowledgement, and more like something he was carrying right alongside her. May collected the bowl and brought a second portion, smaller, which Clara picked at slowly while the market noise continued around them, and the afternoon light shifted into something cooler and longer. "What happens now?" Clara asked. Jack looked at her directly. He'd been doing that, looking right at her, not over her, not around her, but at her like she was a person worth paying attention to. She'd noticed. She was 4, but she noticed things. "Now I take you and your brother somewhere safe," he said. "Your ranch?" "Yes." She thought about this. Why? It was a fair question, and they both knew it. She watched him consider it honestly, the way adults almost never did when kids asked questions. "Because nobody else is going to," he said at last. "And because you've been carrying that baby by yourself long enough." Clara looked down at Benjamin. He was asleep for real now. Not the worrying stillness of before, but genuine sleep. His chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, his mouth slightly open. "I carried him the whole way here," she said quietly. "I know you did. He's heavier than he looks." "I reckon so." Jack stood, picked up his hat, and held out his hand again. "Let me carry him for a while, just to the wagon, then we'll get you both settled." Clara looked at his hand. She looked at Benny. She looked at Jack's face. Then she held the baby out to him. He took Benjamin with a sureness that surprised her. 2 big, rough hands supporting the tiny head, settling the baby against his chest like he'd done it 1,000 times, which she'd later understand he had. Eli had been that small once. "He won't wake up?" she asked, standing, her legs steadier now with food in her. "He might," Jack said, "but I've got him." She walked beside him out of the market, through the thinning crowd toward the line of wagons and horses tied at the far end of the street. People looked at them as they passed, at the big, weathered man with the sleeping infant against his chest and the small, barefoot girl at his side. And a few of them had the decency to look away with something like shame. Clara noticed that too. She noticed everything. Jack's wagon was a working rig, plain and functional, with a canvas cover and a bed of hay in the back. He helped her climb up first, then handed Benjamin back to her once she was settled. She arranged the baby across her lap and wrapped the edge of her torn dress around him against the evening breeze that was just starting to come down off the high country. "How far is your ranch?" she asked as Jack climbed up to the front. 4 miles, 20 minutes, maybe less." "Is your boy there, Eli?" "He is." "Will he mind that we're coming?" Jack was quiet for a moment. "He'll be fine," he said. It wasn't quite an answer, but she let it go. She was tired. Bone-deep, hollowed-out tired. The kind of tired you only get when you've been running on fear for 2 straight days. With the rocking of the wagon and the sound of the horses and the weight of Benjamin warm and breathing in her lap, she felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Not safe, not yet. She was too smart for that. But something adjacent to it. Something like the edge of safe, the possibility of it close enough to almost touch. She watched the road unspool behind them as the wagon moved, the dust rising and settling, the sky going from hard blue to the first soft shades of evening. "Mr. Harper," she said. "Jack," he corrected. "Jack." She tried it out. It felt strange on her tongue. Strange to call a grown man by his first name. Strange to be talking to a grown man who answered when she spoke. "What do I do if Benny gets sick again?" "You tell me," he said right away. "Day or night. You won't be mad." He looked back at her over his shoulder just for a second. "No, Clara, I won't be mad." She looked down at Benjamin. His face in the fading light was small and perfect, and so completely dependent on her that it sometimes felt like a stone sitting on her chest, the weight of being needed by someone who had absolutely no one else. "Okay," she said quietly. She didn't sleep. She meant to stay awake the whole way. Old habits, too many nights of needing to hear danger before it arrived. But somewhere in the last mile, between the rocking and the warmth and the sound of Jack's steady breathing up front, her body made a decision without her permission. She was asleep before the ranch came into view. Jack heard the change in her breathing. He glanced back, saw her slumped against the side of the wagon, Benjamin still clutched safe against her chest, her small face completely slack for the first time since he'd found her. No tension, no vigilance. Just a child sleeping the way children were supposed to sleep. He faced forward again, said nothing, let her rest. The Harper ranch came up through the dark like a lit window in a cold room. And when Eli came out to the porch to see who was coming, he stopped at the sight of his father climbing down from the wagon with a sleeping 4-year-old over one shoulder and a 6-week-old baby in the crook of his other arm. "Pa," Eli said slowly. "Go get the spare blankets," Jack said, "the ones in the cedar chest, and fill the wash basin." Eli went. Jack stood there a moment in the yard, the 2 children balanced in his arms, the night coming full around him. He looked up at the sky, habit, a rancher's reflex, checking weather, and then looked back down at the girl on his shoulder, at the baby against his chest. He hadn't planned for this. He hadn't planned for much of anything the last 3 years beyond getting through it, getting Eli through it, keeping the ranch together, keeping himself upright. That had been the whole of his ambition since the day he'd buried Margaret. And it had been enough. It had had to be. He walked toward the house. From somewhere in the dark behind him, in the direction of the road, he heard the distant sound of a wagon moving fast. Too fast for the hour, too fast for the terrain. And then it was gone, swallowed by distance. He told himself it was nothing. He went inside. He put Clara down on the narrow bed in the back room, the one that had been a sewing room, then a storage room, then nothing, and laid Benjamin in the drawer he'd pulled from the dresser, lined with the softest blankets he had. The baby's color was better. His breathing was even. He was thin and underfed and underdeveloped. And tomorrow, Jack would need to ride to the Whitfield place and ask Caroline Whitfield, who was nursing her own 3-month-old, if she'd be willing to help. He stood in the doorway of the room for a long moment. Clara hadn't moved. One small hand was stretched out toward the drawer where Benjamin lay, even in sleep, still reaching for her brother, still making sure he was there. Eli appeared at Jack's elbow. "Who are they?" "Clara and Benjamin Dunn," Jack said. "They were alone in town, no family." Eli looked at them, at the torn dress, at the bare feet that had walked God knows how far. "What happened to their mama?" "Don't know yet." "Are they staying?" Jack put a hand on his son's shoulder. "For now," he said. "Go to bed." After Eli had gone, Jack stood a while longer. The ranch was quiet around him, the kind of quiet that a living house makes, breathing and settling. And outside the window, the last of the evening had folded itself into full dark. He thought about the wagon he'd heard on the road. He thought about Judge Voss, whose name had come up twice in town today, in conversations he hadn't been part of, but had heard the edges of. Something about paperwork, something about placement records, something about children owed to the county. He thought about the way Clara had looked at him when she'd decided to take his hand, like she was making a choice she knew she might regret, but making it anyway because the alternative was worse. He reached out and pulled the door almost shut. Not all the way, just enough to give them privacy without closing them off, and walked back down the hall to sit at the kitchen table in the dark. He had 4 miles between them and town. He wasn't sure that was enough, but tonight it would have to be. Tonight, Clara Dunn was asleep in a real bed for the first time in days, and her baby brother was breathing steady in a lined drawer. And Jack Harper was sitting in his kitchen, thinking about how fast things could change in a single afternoon, and how some things, once you saw them, you couldn't unsee. He poured himself a glass of water, drank it slowly. Outside, the Texas night settled over the valley, and somewhere on the road between Caldwell Flats and the ranch, wheels turned in the dark. Jack didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table until the candle burned down to nothing, and then he sat in the dark, listening. Every creak of the house, every shift of wind against the shutters, every sound the horses made out in the paddock. He catalogued all of it, the way a man does when his instincts are telling him something his mind hasn't caught up to yet. Just before first light, he heard Benjamin cry. It was a thin, reedy sound, nothing like the full-lunged wail a healthy baby throws, but it was a cry, real and insistent. And Jack was on his feet before it finished its first note. He pushed open the back room door and found Clara already awake, already upright, already reaching into the drawer with both arms. "I got him," she said. Her voice was rough with sleep, but her eyes were sharp. "I got him." "I know you do." Jack crouched beside the drawer. Benjamin's face was scrunched and red, his fists working the air. "He needs to eat. I'm going to ride out this morning and make arrangements. Until then," he paused. "Can you keep him calm?" "I always keep him calm," she said. "Not defensive, just factual." Jack looked at her for a moment. 4 years old, sitting cross-legged on a stranger's bed in the gray pre-dawn, holding her 6-week-old brother against her shoulder and patting his back in that slow, practiced rhythm that she must have learned out of pure necessity. He'd met grown women who didn't have that kind of steadiness. "I know you do," he said again, quieter this time. He built a fire in the stove, put water on to heat, and was pulling on his coat when Eli appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair flattened on one side, eyes still half closed. "Where you going?" Eli asked. "Whitfield Place. Back in 2 hours." Jack checked his watch. "You eat breakfast. There's cornmeal in the tin. And check on the girl in the back room, see if she needs anything." Eli's eyes went to the hallway. "She awake?" "She's been awake since before you were." Eli absorbed this. He was a thoughtful boy, careful about things. Always had been, more like his mother in that way than Jack. He stood there working something over in his expression that Jack recognized as the precursor to a question he wasn't sure he should ask. "Go ahead," Jack said. "Are they in trouble? Those kids?" Jack put on his hat. "Yes." "From what?" "I'll explain when I get back." He opened the door. "Cornmeal's in the tin, Eli. Don't burn it." He rode out before the sun was fully up, and he pushed the horse harder than he normally would have. And when he reached the Whitfield place, he tied up at the post and knocked on the door, and found Caroline Whitfield already in her kitchen, with her own baby at her hip, and her expression somewhere between surprised and wary. "Jack Harper," she said. "It's barely past dawn." "I know it. I'm sorry, Caroline." He took off his hat. "I need to ask a favor." She looked at his face. Whatever she saw there made her step back from the door and let him in. He explained quickly. Clara, Benjamin, the market, the state of them, the 2 days alone. Caroline's expression moved through several things in rapid succession. By the time he'd finished, she was already pulling her shawl off the hook by the door. "I can nurse him twice a day," she said, "morning and evening, and I'll send milk back with you in a jar. Keep it cool. Give it to him on a cloth the way you showed the girl." She paused. "That'll do for the in-betweens." She looked at him squarely. "And Jack, what about the mother?" "Gone." "Gone how?" "I don't know yet." Caroline tied her shawl at her throat. "And Voss, does he know about them?" The name landed in the room like a stone into water, and Jack felt the ripple of it move through his chest. "Not yet," he said. "He will," she said simply. "You know that. Somebody in that market saw you leave with them. Somebody always talks." "I know." "Then you need to move fast, Jack. You know how he works." She picked up a baby jar from the counter and began filling it from her own stores, her hands quick and certain. "He's had his eye on the county orphan rolls for 8 years. Any child without documented family goes straight into his placement system, and Lord knows where they end up after that." Her voice stayed level, but just barely. "I've heard things." "So have I." "Then you know you've got maybe 2 days before someone files a report." She handed him the jar. "You got a lawyer?" "I know a man in Abilene." "Then you'd better wire him today." She looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has watched men talk around hard things for too long. "Those children need to be documented as being in your care, Jack. Voluntary guardianship on paper, filed properly before Voss gets wind of them." He rode back to the ranch with the jar in his saddlebag and Caroline's words following him every step of the way. When he came through the kitchen door, he stopped. Eli was sitting at the table. Across from him, close enough that their knees were almost touching, sat Clara. Benjamin was in her lap, and she had an expression on her face that was halfway between suspicious and something else he couldn't name. On the table between them was a bowl of cornmeal, a tin cup of water, and a piece of dried jerky that Eli had apparently produced from somewhere. "She wouldn't eat the cornmeal at first," Eli reported without looking up from his own bowl. "Said she didn't know if it was okay to take food." Jack looked at Clara. "It's okay to take food," he said. She looked at the bowl, then at Jack. "You sure?" He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "Everything in this house, food, water, blankets, whatever you need, you don't have to ask. You just take it. Understand?" She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she picked up the spoon. Eli watched her eat with the careful attention of a child trying to figure something out. "How old are you?" he asked. 4. "I'm 10. I know, your pa told me." "You've been alone 2 whole days?" "Eli," Jack said, "I'm just asking." "I know what you're doing. Eat your breakfast." Eli ate. But he kept watching Clara out of the corner of his eye with an expression that Jack recognized as the beginning of something. Not pity, that would have been worse, but something more like recognition, like he was looking at someone who had been through a kind of hard he hadn't imagined before, and was taking notes. After breakfast, Jack sent Eli out to the barn and sat down with Clara properly. Benjamin was asleep again, full from the cloth feeding, and she'd put him back in the drawer cradle and come back to the table like she was reporting for duty. "I need to tell you some things," Jack said, "and I need you to listen carefully, even if it's hard to understand. Can you do that?" She folded her hands on the table. "Yes." He told her as plainly as he could, edited for age. There was a man, a judge in town, who handled children who didn't have parents. That man would likely hear about them soon. And before that happened, Jack needed to make sure that Clara and Benjamin were listed as being in his care officially, so that no one could come and take them somewhere else. Clara listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at him. "This judge," she said, "is he bad?" Jack measured his answer. "I think he does things that aren't right." I think children who go through his system don't always end up somewhere good." She was quiet for a moment. "What if he comes here? Then I'll deal with him." "How?" she repeated. Her voice hadn't risen. She wasn't panicking. She was asking with the same flat, practical seriousness she applied to everything, as if fear was a luxury she'd decided she couldn't afford. "I need to know." He looked at her across the table and thought about lying to her, about softening it, about the gentle fictions adults tell children to make them feel safe. He thought about it, and then he didn't do it. "There's a deputy in town I trust," he said. "Man named Owen Marsh, and I'm going to wire a lawyer in Abilene today, and I'm going to file papers with the county clerk before the week is out that say you and Benjamin are in my legal care." He paused. "It won't be simple, but I'm going to do it." Clara looked at him for a long time, long enough that it started to feel like an examination. "Why?" she finally said. He didn't look away. "Because you deserve someone too." She unfolded her hands from the table, folded them again, looked at Benjamin in the drawer, then looked back at Jack. "Okay," she said. He rode into town that afternoon, leaving Eli with specific instructions about the baby, and an equally specific tone of voice that Eli knew meant this was not optional, this was not negotiable, this was what they were doing. He went straight to the telegraph office and wired Thomas Greaves in Abilene, a man he'd done business with twice and trusted with the kind of things you didn't trust just anyone with. Then he walked to the sheriff's office. Owen Marsh was at his desk, 40 years old, broad across the shoulders, with the permanently resigned expression of a lawman who has spent too long watching the same problems circle back around. He looked up when Jack came in, and then looked at him more carefully when he saw the set of his jaw. "What happened?" Owen said. Jack sat down and talked. Owen listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Jack valued about him. When Jack was done, Owen leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "2 children," he said. "Unregistered, no documentation, no living parent confirmed." "That's right." Owen brought his eyes back down. "Jack, the minute Voss hears—" "I know. He's going to claim jurisdiction. He's going to say they belong in county placement. He's going to—" "Owen," Jack leaned forward. "I need to know something. The placement records. The children he sent out in the past 8 years. Is there any way to access those?" Owen went very still. "Why?" he said carefully. "Because I've been hearing things for a long time and not doing anything about them. And now I've got 2 children sitting in my spare room who have nowhere else to go. And I'm not willing to let Voss touch them." He held Owen's gaze. "I want to know what's in those records." Owen was quiet for a long moment. The kind of moment where you can see a man turning something over, measuring risk, measuring conscience. "There are things I've seen," Owen said slowly, "that I filed away because I didn't have enough to act on. Payments recorded in places they shouldn't be. Children placed with households that had no business taking on a child." He paused. "One family out near the Brazos." He stopped. "I couldn't prove anything, not alone." "You're not alone now," Jack said. Owen looked at him. "If we go after Voss and we don't have enough to finish it, he'll bury us both. You understand that? He's got the county behind him. He's got the magistrate's ear. He's got 8 years of political favor built up like a fortress." "I know what he's got," Jack said. "I'm asking if you're willing." The silence between them stretched out over several long seconds. Outside the office window, the afternoon traffic of Caldwell Flats went on, entirely unaware that something was shifting in the room. Owen Marsh looked at his desk, looked at his hands, looked at Jack Harper sitting across from him with an expression that was not a demand and not a plea, but something steady and direct and entirely certain. "I'm willing," Owen said at last, "but we do this right. No half measures." Jack stood and picked up his hat. "No half measures," he agreed. "Start with the records you can access legally. Pull everything you've already seen." He paused. "And Owen, do it quiet." He was halfway to the door when Owen spoke again. "Jack." Jack stopped but didn't turn. "Voss was in the telegraph office this morning around 9. Jack turned. "Then somebody must have wired him last night," Owen said. His voice was even. "He already knows about the children." The air in the room went cold. Jack settled his hat on his head. "How long do I have?" "If I had to guess?" Owen looked at the clock on the wall. "He'll be at your ranch by supper time." Jack walked out of the office, mounted his horse, and rode back toward the ranch at a pace that was just short of a run. His mind was working the whole way, not in panic, but in the cold, rapid calculation of a man who has dealt with enough hard situations to know that emotion is a luxury and clarity is a tool. He was 2 miles from the ranch when he saw the dust. Not his dust. Different direction, coming from the east, from the road that ran between Caldwell Flats and the county seat. Moving with the purpose of something official and unhurried, because it didn't need to hurry. It already knew where it was going. Jack pushed his horse to a full run. He came through the ranch gate and off the horse in one motion, and Eli was on the porch before his boots hit the ground, with an expression that answered the question before Jack could ask it. "Man came," Eli said. His voice was trying to be steady and not entirely succeeding. "About 10 minutes ago, rode up from the east road, said he'd be back." He paused. "He left a card." Jack took the card. Eli held it out. "Judge Henry Voss, County Magistrate and Overseer of Dependent Children." Official business. He turned it over. On the back, in precise, unhurried handwriting, "I understand you have acquired certain children, Mr. Harper. Please expect my visit this evening to discuss their proper disposition." Jack held the card in his hand for a moment. Then he put it in his coat pocket. "Eli," he said, "go inside, stay with Clara and the baby. If anyone comes to the door who isn't me or Owen Marsh, you do not open it. You understand?" Eli understood. He could see it in his son's eyes. The shift from boy to something more. The moment when a child stops being abstract about danger and starts being specific about it. "Yes, sir," Eli said, and went inside without another word. Jack stood in the yard alone, facing the east road, and waited for the dust to get closer. He thought about Clara at the breakfast table, asking how with that flat, practical voice that had no room in it for anything as soft as hope. He thought about Benjamin's cracked lips on the tin cloth, pulling at water with every bit of strength his 6-week-old body possessed. He thought about the card in his pocket. Proper disposition, like they were furniture, like they were cargo. Like 2 children who had survived 2 days alone in the Texas heat, were administrative problems to be processed and filed away. His jaw tightened. The dust on the east road was getting closer. Jack Harper had spent 3 years just getting through it, getting Eli through it, keeping the ranch together, keeping himself upright. That had been the whole of his ambition, and it had been enough. It wasn't enough anymore. Judge Henry Voss rode a gray horse, the kind that cost more than most men in Caldwell Flats made in a year, and he rode it the way he did everything else, like the road had been built specifically for him, and everyone else was merely borrowing it. He came through the ranch gate at an unhurried walk, 2 men flanking him on either side. Not deputies, not lawmen of any kind. Jack recognized the type immediately. Men who were big, quiet, and positioned with the particular purposefulness of people who got paid to make other people feel outnumbered. Jack didn't move from where he stood. Voss pulled up 20 feet away and looked down at him from the saddle with the expression of a man who had never, not once in his professional life, encountered a situation he couldn't control. "Mr. Harper," he said. His voice was pleasant, unhurried, the voice of a man who knows he holds every card. "Thank you for waiting." "Didn't have much choice," Jack said. "You were coming either way." Voss smiled. He was somewhere past 60, thick through the chest, with silver hair and the kind of tan that came not from working outdoors, but from riding outdoors, which was a different thing entirely. He had small eyes set deep under heavy brows, and they were sharp and assessing, and not remotely as friendly as the rest of his face. "I'll come straight to the point," Voss said. "I understand you've taken in 2 children. A girl of approximately 4 years and an infant male, without authorization, without documentation, and without notification to this county's Office of Dependent Children, which is required by statute within 24 hours of assuming informal custody." He tilted his head. "That's a serious oversight, Mr. Harper." "It happened yesterday," Jack said. "I plan to file with the county clerk by end of week. I'm afraid that won't be sufficient." Voss swung down from the saddle with the ease of a younger man. He handed his reins to one of the flanking men and walked toward Jack, stopping at a polite distance that was still somehow too close. "The children need to be assessed, placed appropriately. That's my office's function, and it's not optional. I'm sure you understand." "I understand what your office does," Jack said. "And I understand that the children are currently in my care, fed and safe, and I intend to file formal guardianship papers." Voss raised his eyebrows, as if the idea were charming but slightly naive. "Guardianship is a legal process, Mr. Harper. It takes time. In the interim, county statute is clear. Unaccompanied minors with no documented family must be placed through the county system." He paused. "I'd like to see them now, please." "No." The word fell between them like a dropped axe. Voss's expression didn't change. That was what was unnerving about it. He'd been told no before, and it had never mattered. "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me." Jack didn't raise his voice, didn't shift his stance. "You're not going into my house. You're not seeing those children. Not today. Not until I've had time to speak with my lawyer and understand exactly what my legal rights are in this matter." "Your lawyer?" Voss said it with polite amusement. "In Abilene, I presume. Thomas Greaves." He paused. "Yes, I heard you wired him this morning." The amusement stayed perfectly calibrated, just enough to remind Jack that Voss knew things, that Voss always knew things, that the telegraph office in Caldwell Flats was not as private as one might hope. "Mr. Greaves is a competent man," Voss continued, "but county statute doesn't pause for correspondence, Mr. Harper." "Then we'll settle it in front of a proper court," Jack said. "Which means you leave my property now, and we do this the right way." For the first time, something shifted behind Voss's eyes. Not anger, recalibration. He looked at Jack the way a chess player looks at a board when the other person has made an unexpected move. "You should consider what you're doing," Voss said quietly. "I've been managing this county's dependent children for 8 years. I have the full confidence of the magistrate, the county commissioner, and the Texas statutes." "What do you have, Mr. Harper?" "Those 2 children," Jack said. "That's enough." The silence held for a beat too long. Then Voss nodded once, very slowly, and turned back toward his horse. He mounted with that same unhurried ease and looked down at Jack from the saddle. "I'll be filing a formal request for county assessment by tomorrow morning," he said pleasantly. "You'll be served notice. I'd advise you to have your affairs in order." He pulled the horse's head around. "Good evening, Mr. Harper." He rode out. The 2 flanking men followed without a word or a glance. Then they were through the gate, and the sound of hooves faded down the east road, and the yard was quiet again. Jack stood still for exactly 10 seconds. Then he went inside. Clara was in the hallway. She'd been there long enough to have heard most of it through the door. He could tell by her expression, which was not the expression of a child who had heard nothing but the muffled sound of adult conversation. It was the expression of a child who had heard every word and processed it with that flat, clear intelligence that she seemed to apply to everything. "He's going to try to take us," she said. Jack crouched down to her level. "He's going to try. That's different from doing it." "What's the difference?" "Me," Jack said, "and Owen, and Thomas Greaves in Abilene, and the fact that he just tipped his hand by coming here before he had the paperwork to back it up." He looked at her steadily. "He wanted to scare me into handing you over without a fight. That tells me he's not as certain of his ground as he wants me to think." Clara chewed on this. "What do we do tonight?" "You stay here. Eli stays with you. I'm going to ride back into town." "What for?" He stood. "There are some things I need to look at." She grabbed the sleeve of his coat, not hard, just a small, certain grip. "Jack," he stopped. "Don't let him take Benny," she said. Her voice was even. No waver, no plea in it, just the raw, uncomplicated truth of what she was asking. "Benny can't fight for himself. He's too little." Jack put his hand over hers on his sleeve. "I know he is," he said. "That's why I'm going tonight." He told Eli to bolt the door and not open it for anyone, again, in a tone that left no room for debate. And he rode out before full dark, pushing east toward town. Owen Marsh was waiting for him at the back door of the sheriff's office, which meant Owen had ridden fast from somewhere himself. Or maybe he'd never left. "He went to your place," Owen said the moment Jack was inside. "He did. Wanted to take them tonight. I think he was counting on me not knowing the statute well enough to push back. He filed the assessment request at 4 o'clock this afternoon," Owen said, "before he even rode out to your ranch." Jack went still. So the visit was theater. The visit was a warning. Owen sat on the edge of his desk. "He's done this before, Jack. He rides out. He introduces himself. He lets them know he's coming. And by the time the paperwork arrives, half of them have already handed the children over just to avoid the trouble." He looked up. "But that's not why I'm glad you came tonight." Something in Owen's voice made Jack pay closer attention. Owen stood, went to the cabinet behind his desk, and pulled out a leather folder that had seen considerable use. He set it on the desk between them. "I've been sitting on this for 2 years," he said, "waiting for the right moment, the right reason, or the right person." Jack opened the folder. The first page was a handwritten ledger entry, dates, names, payment amounts. The second was a letter from a household outside of Abilene, describing conditions that tightened Jack's stomach on the first read and made him feel physically cold by the third line. The third was a record of a child placed with that same household by Judge Henry Voss's office, signed and sealed, neat as anything. He went through it slowly. Owen let him. 8 years, Owen said quietly. 43 children I can document. There are probably more I can't. He charges placement fees to the families that take them in. Legally, officially, it's called a county administration cost. But then he takes a separate payment, off the books, from certain households. The ones that aren't using the children for legitimate work. The ones that aren't using them at all, Jack said. His voice came out flat and controlled because the alternative was something he didn't have time for right now. "Some of the children on this list," Owen stopped, pressed his mouth shut, started again. "Some of them I've tried to trace. I can't find them." The room was very quiet. "How solid is this?" Jack asked. "Solid enough to be dangerous, not solid enough for a conviction." Owen sat down. "The payments off the books, I know they happened. I have 2 sources who told me, but they won't sign a statement. They're afraid of him. He's got 8 years of county backing, Jack. Nobody wants to be the one who goes after him and loses." "What would make it solid enough?" Owen looked at him. "The private ledger. He keeps a second set of accounts, the real ones. My sources say he keeps them locked in his office in a strongbox, behind the county seal portrait on the wall." He paused. "Nobody's been able to get near them." Jack closed the folder. "Where does he sleep?" Jack. "His office is in the county building, ground floor, east wing. He stays at the Cattleman's Hotel when he's in Caldwell Flats. Room 7, I'm told." Owen held his gaze. "I'm not telling you this so you can do something stupid." "I'm not going to do anything stupid," Jack said. "I'm going to do something necessary. There's a difference." "Tonight there is." Owen stood up. "If you're caught, you never had this conversation." Jack picked up his hat. "Wire Greaves again. Tell him I need him here in person, not just on paper. Tell him what you've told me." He moved toward the door. "And Owen, keep a watch on the east road to my ranch." "What for?" "Because Voss doesn't strike me as someone who waits for paperwork when he's got other options." Jack looked back over his shoulder. "He's going to try to take those children before I can file anything. Maybe tonight. Maybe tomorrow before dawn." Owen's jaw tightened. "I'll ride the east road myself." "I was hoping you'd say that." Jack left through the back. The county building was dark by the time he reached it. After hours, skeleton staff, the night watchman doing his rounds on a schedule that Jack had observed before without knowing he'd need the information. He moved through it quickly, no candle, no lantern, relying on the ambient light from the street and the layout he'd recalled from the 3 times he'd filed legitimate paperwork in this building over the years. Voss's office was locked. The lock was not a good one. Inside, the room smelled of paper and tobacco, and something underneath both that Jack couldn't name but didn't like. He found the portrait of the county seal immediately, large, hung slightly off-center on the east wall, and behind it, exactly where Owen's source had said, a strongbox set into a shallow alcove in the wall. The box had a combination mechanism. Jack stood in the dark and thought about it for a moment. He was not a man who broke locks. That was not a skill he'd cultivated, and he wasn't going to start tonight. But the box itself was bolted to the alcove with 4 screws, and the alcove was wood, and the wood was not new. And there were things in Jack Harper's pockets that were more useful than a combination, given enough patience. He had the box loose in 12 minutes. He didn't open it there. He wrapped it in the piece of burlap he'd brought in his saddlebag and walked out the way he'd come in. And he rode 2 streets over to a place that wasn't the sheriff's office, but was close enough. And he opened it in the light of a single lamp in the back room of the Caldwell Flats Courier, where an old man named Marcus Hale had been printing news for 30 years and had very specific feelings about Judge Henry Voss that he'd never been in a position to publish. Marcus looked at the ledger inside the box for 4 minutes without speaking. Then he looked up at Jack. "This is it," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "This is everything. Names, dates, payments, both sides of it. The official fees and the—" He stopped. "The other payments." He turned a page. His face did something difficult. "Jack, some of these children, the placement dates and the last recorded check-in dates don't match. There are children in here who were placed in 1879, and the last record of them is 1879. Nothing after." "I know," Jack said. "You know what that could mean?" "I know what it likely means." He kept his voice level through a focused effort of will. "Marcus, can you make copies tonight?" Marcus Hale looked at him over the ledger. He was 70 years old and had survived a war and 2 floods, and the death of his wife and the near death of his newspaper. And he had the eyes of a man who had been waiting for a particular moment for a very long time. "I've been setting the type in my head for 2 years," he said. "Give me 3 hours." Jack left the box with Marcus and rode back toward his ranch on the road that avoided the east approach, the back way, longer but quieter. He was a mile out when he saw the flicker of a lantern, moving where there shouldn't have been movement. Not on the road, off it, cutting through the scrub toward the ranch from the north side. He pulled his horse to a stop and sat in the dark and watched. 2 men, moving deliberately. Not Owen. Owen would come by the road, and Owen would carry a lantern openly because he had nothing to hide. These men were trying not to be seen, which meant they were doing something that required not being seen. Jack had left Eli with instructions to bolt the door. He turned his horse off the road and rode hard into the dark. He came around the back of the ranch in time to hear someone trying the barn door, checking it, testing it, not forcing it yet. Working up to something. He dismounted 20 yards out, left the horse ground-tied, and came in on foot, fast, because fast and quiet were sometimes the same thing when you knew the ground and the other man didn't. The first man heard him at 4 yards and turned. "Step back," Jack said. His voice was not loud. It was the quietest kind of dangerous. "Step back from the door and put your hands where I can see them." The second man came around the corner of the barn and stopped when he saw the situation. "Voss send you?" Jack asked. Neither man answered, but neither man moved toward him, which told him something about what kind of men they were, hired for presents, not for genuine trouble. They'd expected an empty yard, maybe a sleeping household, not this. "Go back," Jack said. "Go back and tell him it didn't work." He paused. Let the weight of what came next land properly. "And tell him I found the ledger." Something moved in the first man's expression, surprise, and under it, something closer to fear. They knew what the ledger was, which meant Voss had told them enough to send them here tonight as a contingency, a backup plan in case the paperwork took too long. Which meant Voss already knew the ledger was at risk, which meant somebody had seen Jack go into the county building tonight. Jack kept his face still. Inside his chest, everything was moving fast. The 2 men backed up all the way to where they'd left their horses in the scrub, mounted, and rode north without a word. Jack watched them go, stood there until the sound of them faded completely. Then he turned and looked at the house. Lamplight in the back room window. Clara was awake. He walked to the house, unbolted the door with the knock he'd taught Eli before he'd left, 3 short, 1 long. And when the door opened, both Clara and Eli were standing in the hallway with the same expression. Alert, controlled, not panicking, but close enough to it that the difference was thin. "I heard someone at the barn," Eli said. "I know, they're gone." "Who were they?" Jack looked at Eli, then at Clara, who was holding Benjamin against her shoulder and watching him with those flat, serious eyes. "Men who work for Voss," he said. They wanted to scare us." "Did it work?" Clara asked. He almost smiled. "No." She nodded once, as if this confirmed something she'd already decided. "Good," she said. She turned and walked back down the hall toward the back room, patting Benjamin's back in that slow, steady rhythm, and her voice came back to them from the dark of the hallway. "I knew you'd come back." It landed in Jack's chest and stayed there. He locked the door and went to stand watch at the kitchen window. And somewhere across town, Marcus Hale's printing press had started its slow, methodical turn. And by morning, the shape of everything was going to be different. Jack didn't sleep at the kitchen window. He sat there through the longest part of the night with his rifle across his knees and his coffee gone cold, and his mind running the same track over and over. The ledger, the names, the dates that stopped without explanation, until the darkness outside the glass began to thin at the edges, and birds started up in the scrub, and the ranch came back to itself in the slow gray way of early morning. At 5 o'clock, hoofbeats on the road, one horse moving fast. He was at the door before the rider reached the gate. Owen Marsh swung down from the saddle, looking like a man who had also not slept, and he came through the gate with a paper in his hand and an expression that was trying to be controlled and not quite making it. "Marcus is done," Owen said. "He made 6 full copies of the ledger. I've got 2 of them. He's holding the others." He thrust the paper at Jack. "But that's not why I wrote out." Jack took the paper. It was a telegraph receipt, incoming, not outgoing, time-stamped at 4:47 in the morning from the Austin office. He read it once, read it again. "When did this come in?" "Less than an hour ago." Owen's voice was tight. "Someone in Austin has been watching Voss longer than either of us knew. The moment I wired Greaves last night with the specifics, Greaves wired the state attorney's office directly. Apparently, it wasn't the first time that office had heard Henry Voss's name." The telegraph read, R.E. Voss, County Magistrate, State Inquiry open since 1881. Awaiting actionable documentation. Marshal R. Calhoun dispatched upon receipt of your correspondence. Arrive Caldwell Flats approximately 36 hours. Jack lowered the paper. "They already had a file on him." "Incomplete," Owen said. "They knew something was wrong. They didn't have what we have." He looked at Jack. "What Marcus printed last night, that's the piece they've been missing for 2 years." Jack looked at the telegram, looked at Owen. 36 hours, give or take. "Voss is going to move before then." "Yes," Owen said, "he is." They both knew it without needing to spell it out. A man like Henry Voss, 8 years of careful architecture, every piece of it balanced against the others, would feel the shift in the air, the same way Jack had felt it the night before. The ledger was gone. The 2 men he'd sent to the ranch had come back empty, and somewhere between midnight and dawn, the ground had changed under him. "He'll go after the children directly," Jack said. "A formal order, emergency county placement. He'll claim the household is unsafe, that I'm not a suitable guardian, something along those lines. He'll get a local magistrate to sign it before anyone from Austin gets here." "Magistrate Dills," Owen said. "He'll go to Dills. They've been in each other's pockets for years. How fast can Dills sign something if Voss is standing in his office at 7 o'clock in the morning with the paperwork already written?" Owen looked at him. "An hour, maybe less." Jack handed the telegram back. "Then we have less than an hour." He went inside, woke Eli with a hand on his shoulder and 2 sentences, and was back in the kitchen in under 3 minutes with his coat on and his hat in his hand. Clara was already awake. Clara, it seemed, was always already awake, operating on some internal alarm that never fully let her rest, and she was standing in the hallway with Benjamin against her chest, watching him with those eyes that saw too much for a 4-year-old. "Something's happening," she said. "Yes. What do we do?" He looked at her. He had promised himself he wouldn't lie to her, and he wasn't going to start now. "We go into town," he said. "All of us, right now." She didn't argue. She didn't ask why. She just turned around and went to get her shoes. Owen rode ahead. Jack put Eli and Clara in the wagon, Benjamin in the crook of Clara's arm, both children positioned in the wagon bed where they'd be less visible from the road. He pushed the horses at a pace that was not quite reckless, but was close enough that the wagon protested on every rut. Eli gripped the sideboard with both hands and didn't complain once. They reached town before 7 o'clock. Owen was waiting at the edge of the main street with his hand up. "Stop! Hold here!" Jack pulled the wagon to a halt and watched Owen ride toward him with the expression of someone who has information that just changed shape. "He's already at Dill's," Owen said, low and fast. "Rode in before 6. I had a boy watching the hotel and he followed him." He leaned from the saddle. "Jack, he didn't go alone. He brought 4 men this time, not deputies, not official ones." Jack looked down the street toward the magistrate's office. 60 yards, maybe 70. A building he'd walked past 100 times without thinking much of it. "Can you get to Dill's before Voss gets that signature?" "Not alone," Owen said. "Dill's won't hear me over Voss. They've got too much history." He paused. "But if someone else walked in, someone with standing." "What kind of standing?" Owen reached into his coat and pulled out one of Marcus's printed copies of the ledger, folded, dense with handwriting and dates and numbers. "The kind that comes from having documented evidence of 8 years of fraud and child exploitation in your hand when you open the door." Jack took the copy. He looked at it. He looked at the magistrate's office down the street. "Stay with the wagon," he said to Eli, in the tone that left no room. "You don't move from here. You understand me?" "Yes, sir." He looked at Clara. She was watching him with Benjamin held tight and her chin up, and she looked so much older than 4 that it made something ache in his chest. "Back soon," he said. "I know," she said. He and Owen walked down the street together at a pace that was not running but covered ground quickly. And Jack had the folded ledger copy under his arm, and the particular calm of a man who had made his decision and was done deliberating about it. The magistrate's office door was closed but not locked. Owen pushed it open without knocking. The room had 3 people in it. Magistrate Dills, small, pink-faced, 65 years old, accustomed to having the law be a quiet and administrative process, was behind his desk with a pen in his hand and a paper in front of him. Henry Voss was standing to one side with his hands clasped behind his back. And a third man Jack didn't recognize was standing by the window, broad-shouldered, watching the door. The pen stopped moving. "Marsh," Dills said with the strangled dignity of someone being interrupted at something he knows is wrong. "This is a private." "That's a placement order, isn't it?" Owen said. Not a question. He looked at the paper in front of Dills. "Emergency custody transfer for the Dunn children." Voss turned. He looked at Jack, then at the ledger copy under Jack's arm, and something happened in his face. Barely visible, controlled almost immediately, but it was there. A fracture, the first one Jack had seen in that composed surface. "Mr. Harper," Voss said pleasantly, "you've saved me a trip." Jack stepped forward and placed the ledger copy on the desk, flat, directly in front of the pen and the unsigned order. "Before you sign anything, I'd ask you to look at that." Dills looked at it. Looked at Voss. "Don't," Voss started. "It's a copy," Jack said. "The originals are already in the hands of the state attorney's office in Austin, delivered this morning by telegraph correspondence through Thomas Greaves of Abilene." He kept his voice even, informational, like he was discussing a real estate transaction. "There's also a United States Marshal dispatched from Austin who will arrive in Caldwell Flats within 36 hours. He looked at Dills. "What you're holding in front of you is a detailed record of every off-the-books payment made to Judge Voss over 8 years in connection with the placement of 43 children through this county's dependent system, including 17 children whose records end at their placement date, with no subsequent documentation of any kind." The room was so quiet that the ticking of the clock on Dills's wall was audible. Dills picked up the ledger copy. He read the first page. His face went from pink to something considerably less certain. "This is—" he looked at Voss. "Henry, what is this?" "It's fabricated," Voss said. His voice had shed the pleasantness. Not by much, he was too disciplined for that, but the warmth was gone, replaced by something colder and more precise. "It's a fabrication produced by a man who is desperately trying to circumvent lawful county process because he has formed an inappropriate attachment to 2 vagrant children who belong in county care." He looked at Jack with eyes that had stopped pretending. "You have no idea what you've opened, Mr. Harper." "I think I do," Jack said, And I think you know I do. Voss turned back to Dills. Sign the order, Horace. It's a routine placement. 17 children, Henry. Dills's voice had gone thin and strange. He was still looking at the ledger copy. 17 children with no record after placement. I've known you 20 years. I want you to look me in the face right now and tell me what that means. Voss looked at him. He didn't answer. It was the loudest silence Jack had ever heard in an enclosed room. Dills set the ledger copy down, set his pen down beside it, and then he did something that clearly surprised Voss, because Voss's composure finally, visibly, slipped. Dills picked up the unsigned placement order, looked at it for a moment, and folded it in half. I need more time to review this material, Dills said carefully. His voice was the voice of a man who has just realized that the water he's been standing in is much deeper than he'd been told. The placement order will not be signed today. Horace. Voss's voice had an edge now. Dills looked at him, and whatever he saw in Voss's face in that unguarded moment settled something in the old magistrate that would not be unsettled. Don't. The man by the window shifted his weight. Owen's hand moved to his belt, not drawing, not yet, but stating something clear and physical about the order of events if things moved in a particular direction. They didn't move in that direction. Voss straightened his jacket, looked at Jack. The expression on his face was not defeat. Men like Henry Voss didn't wear defeat. They wore recalculation. But it was something adjacent to it, an acknowledgement that the board had changed. This isn't over, he said quietly. It will be, Jack said, in about 36 hours. Voss walked out. The man by the window followed him. The door closed. Owen let out a breath. Dills sat back in his chair and looked at the ledger copy with the expression of a man who was already beginning to understand how much he didn't want to know. The children are safe? Dills asked. His voice was quieter now, older. They're in my wagon at the end of the street, Jack said. Dills nodded slowly. I'll issue a temporary protective order. Voluntary guardianship pending formal filing. It won't hold against a direct state challenge, but it'll slow anything Voss tries locally. He looked up at Jack. You'd better hope your marshal gets here when you think he will. So had Voss, Jack said. He walked out into the street and down to the wagon, and when Clara saw his face, she read it correctly before he said a word. We're okay, she said, not a question. For now. He climbed up to the wagon seat. Let's go home. But even as he said it, he knew. Home wasn't a place you could get to and stop. It was something you had to hold on to. And Voss wasn't done yet. The 36 hours stretched ahead like a rope under tension, and somewhere in the dark of that waiting, the judge was already planning his next move. The morning after the confrontation in Dills's office came slow and heavy, the way mornings do when you've spent the night waiting for something that hasn't arrived yet. Jack had slept in the chair by the front door, rifle across his knees, waking at every creak and rustle until the first gray light seeped through the window and he realized he was still alive and the children were still safe, and Voss had not come back in the dark. He stood, worked the stiffness out of his shoulders, and walked down the hall. The door to the back room was cracked open the way he'd left it. He pushed it wider with one finger and looked in. Clara was awake. Of course she was. She sat cross-legged on the narrow bed with Benjamin in her lap, both of them wrapped in the same worn blanket. She was humming something, a tune he didn't recognize, low and aimless, the kind of sound a child makes when she's trying to fill a silence that feels too big. Benjamin's eyes were open, which was new. They were unfocused and wandering, the way infant eyes do when they're still figuring out what seeing means, but they were open, and they were clear. Jack leaned against the doorframe. You been up long? Since before the birds, Clara said. She didn't look at him. Her attention was on Benjamin's face, watching his little mouth work around nothing, watching his fingers curl and uncurl. He woke up hungry. I fed him from the jar Caroline left. He took the whole cloth. Good. He's gaining weight, I can tell. She looked at Jack then, and her eyes had that flat seriousness that he was beginning to recognize as her default state. His cheeks aren't as hollow as they were. It was true. In 3 days, Benjamin had gone from skeletal to merely thin. The change was small, but it was there. Jack had noticed it too. You're doing a good job with him, he said. I know, Clara said. And then, after a pause, "You're doing a good job with us." She said it the way she said everything, direct, unsentimental, like she was stating a fact that had been verified and required no further comment. It hit him harder than any thank you could have. He cleared his throat. "I'm going to start breakfast. You want eggs?" "I want whatever you're making." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I got." She looked down at Benjamin. "He's the one who gets to be picky, not me." Jack stood there a moment longer, watching her adjust the blanket around the baby's shoulders with hands that were too small and too careful for a child her age. Then he turned and went to the kitchen. Eli was already at the table, staring at the cold stove like he expected it to light itself. He looked up when Jack came in. "Did you sleep at all?" Eli asked. "Some." "You're lying." Jack pulled the coffee pot down from the shelf. "Watch your mouth." "I'm not wrong." "No, but you're not respectful either." Jack struck a match and lit the stove. The flame caught and spread, and he set the skillet on the grate. "You check on the animals yet?" "First light." "And?" "And nothing. Everything's where it's supposed to be." Eli paused. "I walked the fence line along the north pasture, saw tracks." Jack's hand stopped over the skillet. "What kind of tracks?" "Horse, 2 of them, came in from the east road, cut across the scrub, and then turned back the same way." Eli's voice was careful, measured. He'd learned that from his mother. "They didn't come close enough to the house to leave prints in the yard." Just the pasture edge. Jack cracked 3 eggs into the skillet and watched them set. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "How old were the tracks?" "Fresh. Last night, I think. Maybe after you got back from town." Jack nodded. He'd known Voss would try again. The question was when and how. A legal ambush in Dills's office had failed. A direct midnight grab had failed. The next move would be different, smarter, quieter, harder to stop. "After breakfast," Jack said, "I want you to ride over to the Whitfield place. Tell Caroline we're fine, but ask her to keep an eye on the road from her side. If she sees anyone coming who doesn't belong, I want to know before they get here." Eli nodded. "What about you?" "I'm going to wire Owen, see if he's heard anything about Voss's next play." "And Clara and Benjamin?" "They stay here with me until you get back. Nobody goes anywhere alone until that marshal arrives." Eli absorbed this without argument. He was a boy who understood the weight of instructions when they came in a certain tone. He ate his eggs in silence, and when Clara came out of the back room with Benjamin propped against her shoulder, he got up and pulled out the chair beside him without being asked. Clara looked at the chair, looked at Eli, then climbed up and settled Benjamin in the crook of her arm so she could eat one-handed. She did it without asking for help, without complaining, without drawing attention to the fact that she was managing something no 4-year-old should have to manage. Jack watched her and said nothing because there was nothing to say that she didn't already know. After breakfast, Eli rode out. Jack stood on the porch and watched him until he was a speck on the east road, then went inside and found Clara sitting on the floor of the front room, with Benjamin on a blanket beside her. She had a piece of string in her hands and was trying to make something with it. A cat's cradle, maybe, or something she'd seen another child do once. "Can I help you with anything?" Jack asked. She shook her head. "I'm fine. Benny's fine. You got things to do." He did have things to do. He needed to check the fence in the south pasture, needed to look at the windmill that had been making a strange noise for 2 days, needed to think about what he would do if Voss found a way around the legal blockers before the marshal arrived. But he didn't move from the doorway. "Clara," she looked up, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it straight." She set the string down and folded her hands in her lap. That attentive posture again, like a student waiting for a lesson. "I don't know exactly what's going to happen in the next day and a half. I know what I want to happen. I know what I'm going to try to make happen. But I can't promise you that Voss won't try something else before that marshal gets here. And I can't promise you that it'll be easy." He paused. "But I can promise you this. As long as I'm standing, nobody is taking you or Benjamin anywhere you don't want to go." Clara looked at him for a long time. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked off the seconds. Outside, a jay called from the mesquite. "I know," she said. "I knew that the first day, in the market." "How?" She shrugged, a small, precise movement. "You crouched down." Grown-ups don't crouch down unless they're going to tell you something you won't like. But you crouched down and you stayed there, and you looked at me like I was a person. She picked the string back up and began working it between her fingers. I figured if you thought I was a person, you probably thought Benny was one too. Jack didn't have a response to that. He stood in the doorway for another moment, then turned and went to mend the windmill. The morning passed in the kind of false quiet that precedes a storm. The sky stayed clear, the wind stayed light, and nothing moved on the east road except the occasional dust devil. Jack fixed the windmill, checked the fence, and fed the horses. Clara stayed in the front room with Benjamin, and when Jack came back to the house for lunch, he found her asleep on the floor with her head on the edge of the blanket and one hand resting on Benjamin's stomach. Both of them were breathing in the same slow rhythm. He covered her with his coat and ate standing at the counter. Eli came back just past noon. He swung down from the saddle and tied the horse at the rail with the kind of deliberate motion that told Jack he had news. "Caroline says she'll watch the road," Eli reported. "She also said to tell you that Voss was seen at the telegraph office again this morning, around 9. Jack set down his coffee cup. "Who saw him?" "Old man Hale. He was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the Courier when Voss came out. Said Voss had a piece of paper in his hand and was folding it into his coat pocket, and he looked pleased with himself." Pleased. That was not a word Jack wanted to hear in connection with Henry Voss. "Anything else?" Eli hesitated. "Marcus told me to tell you something else. He said to tell you that he heard Voss mention a name to one of his men as he was leaving. A woman's name." "What name?" "Morgan. He said, 'Get me Morgan.' That's all he heard." Jack picked his coffee back up, but he didn't drink it. He stood at the window and looked out at the east road, and he ran the name through every mental file he had. He didn't know a Morgan. He didn't know anyone who knew a Morgan. But Voss wouldn't be saying that name unless it mattered. Did Marcus know what Morgan meant? No, but he said he'd keep his ears open. Jack nodded. "Good. You did good, Eli." Eli didn't look away. "Pa, what are we going to do if Voss comes back before the marshal gets here?" The question sat between them. It was the same question Jack had been asking himself all morning. "We hold our ground," Jack said, "and we don't back down. That's not a plan." "It's the plan we've got." He set the cup down. "Eli, you're old enough to know the truth. I don't know exactly what Voss is capable of. I know what he's already done, and that's bad enough. But I also know that running won't help. If we run, he wins. And if he wins, Clara and Benjamin end up in his system. And you heard what Owen found in those records. You understand what that means." Eli's jaw tightened. He was 10 years old, but he understood. He'd seen the look on Owen's face when he talked about the children whose records ended in 1879. "I'm not going to let that happen," Eli said. "Neither am I." They stood there in the kitchen, father and son, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Eli turned and went to check on the horses, and Jack stayed at the window, watching the east road, waiting for dust that would tell him someone was coming. It came at 3 in the afternoon. Not from the east road, from the south, across the open range, a single rider moving at a steady trot. Jack recognized the horse before he recognized the rider, a bay mare with a white blaze, the same horse Owen Marsh had been riding for 5 years. He met Owen at the gate. Owen dismounted, his face unreadable. "Got word from Austin. The marshal's on schedule. Should be here by tomorrow afternoon, day after at the latest." "That's the good news," Jack said. "What's the bad?" Owen took off his hat and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "Voss filed a motion this morning with the county clerk. Emergency petition for immediate placement, citing continued resistance to lawful assessment and unstable household conditions. He's claiming that keeping the children on your ranch constitutes a danger to their welfare because of the lack of proper medical care and maternal presence." Jack felt something cold settle in his chest. "That's a weak argument. Half the ranches in this county don't have a woman on the property." "It doesn't have to hold up in court," Owen said. "It just has to convince Dills to sign an interim order before the marshal gets here." "And Dills is scared, Jack. He's old, and he's tired, and he's been in Voss's pocket for so long that he doesn't know which way is up. I sat in his office for an hour this morning, and I watched him go back and forth. He wants to do the right thing, but he's terrified of what Voss will do if he doesn't cooperate. Did he sign it? Owen shook his head. Not yet. He's stalling. Said he needed more time to review the petition. But he told me, off the record, that if Voss produces a medical affidavit from a county physician, he won't have a legal basis to refuse. County physician? We don't have one. The nearest doctor is 40 miles away in Oak Crossing. Voss knows that, but he's got a man on the payroll at the county office who will sign anything he puts in front of him, with or without an actual examination. I've seen it before. It's a paper game, Jack, and Voss has been playing it longer than anyone else in this county. Jack looked out at the horizon, where the sun was beginning its slow slide toward evening. 36 hours had felt like a long time when the marshal's telegram first arrived. Now it felt like no time at all. "What's this Morgan business?" Jack asked. Owen's eyes narrowed. "You heard about that? Marcus saw Voss at the telegraph office this morning." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Morgan is a federal courier, works for the state attorney's office out of Austin. He's the one who's supposed to be delivering the official summons for Voss to appear before the investigative committee." "Supposed to be?" "He didn't show up in Caldwell Flats this morning like he was scheduled to. I checked at the stage office and the railroad depot. No sign of him. And his office in Austin sent a wire saying he left yesterday afternoon and should have arrived by midnight." Jack's hand tightened on the gatepost. "Voss got to him." "I don't know for certain, but the timing's bad, and Voss looked pleased." "Pleased doesn't begin to cover it," Jack said. "What do we do?" Owen put his hat back on. "You stay here. You keep those children close. I'm going to ride out toward Oak Crossing and see if I can find any sign of Morgan's trail. Maybe he took a wrong turn. Maybe the horse threw a shoe. Maybe he just got delayed. But I'm not going to sit around waiting for Voss to make his next play without knowing the full board." "Owen." Owen paused. "Be careful." Owen nodded once, swung back onto his mare, and rode south without another word. Jack watched him go, then turned and walked back to the house. Clara was standing in the doorway. She'd heard enough of the conversation through the open window to know that something had shifted again. "Is it bad?" she asked. "It's not good," Jack said, "but it's not over yet." She looked at him for a moment, then turned and went back inside. Jack followed her, closing the door behind him. The evening passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Eli did his chores without being told. Clara sat on the floor with Benjamin and the piece of string, and every time Jack looked at her, she was watching him with those steady, knowing eyes. She didn't ask questions. She didn't demand explanations. She just watched and waited and held her brother close. Jack cooked supper, beans and salt pork, and the last of the bread Caroline had sent over. They ate at the table in silence, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who were sharing the same weight and didn't need to talk about it to know it was there. After supper, Jack sent Eli to check on the horses one more time and sat down on the porch steps with Clara beside him. Benjamin was asleep in her lap, wrapped in the same cotton blanket, his face turned toward her chest as if he could still hear her heartbeat from the days when they'd been alone together. "Jack?" Clara said. "Yeah." "What happens if the marshal doesn't come?" Jack looked at her. The sky was going from orange to purple, and the first stars were starting to show over the ridge. The air had that cool edge that comes just before full dark. "He'll come," Jack said. "But what if he doesn't?" She wasn't asking out of fear. She was asking out of the same practical calculation she applied to everything. She wanted to know what the backup plan was. She wanted to know what to do if hope failed. Jack thought about it, thought about what he would do if the marshal didn't arrive, if Voss managed to get his petition signed, if the law turned out to be just another tool for people like Henry Voss to use against people like Clara Dunn. Then he told her the truth. "There's a place up in the Panhandle," he said, "a homestead my brother Caleb claimed about 10 years ago. I haven't seen him in 8 years, but he's the kind of man who wouldn't turn away anyone who showed up at his door in trouble. We could go there. Would we have to leave at night? Yes. And we'd have to travel quiet. No fires, no roads." She was asking specific questions, the kind of questions someone asks when they're trying to envision a plan and test it for holes. She was 4 years old, and she was thinking about escape routes. "Yes," Jack said, "that's about right." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I hope the marshal comes." "So do I." She leaned against his arm, just slightly, just enough that he could feel the weight of her trust in that small pressure. Benjamin stirred and resettled, and the stars came out one by one, and the night settled over the Harper ranch like a held breath. Inside the house, Eli was banking the stove for the night. Outside, the wind moved through the mesquite with a sound like whispering. And somewhere on the road between Caldwell Flats and Oak Crossing, Owen Marsh was riding fast through the dark, looking for a man named Morgan, who might not exist anymore. Jack sat on the porch with Clara against his arm and Benjamin sleeping in her lap, and he watched the east road. He watched it until his eyes burned. Nothing moved on it all night. The morning came without color. The sun rose behind a flat sheet of cloud that turned the sky the color of old tin, and the wind picked up from the north, carrying the smell of rain that wouldn't arrive for days. Jack had been on the porch since 3 in the morning, wrapped in his coat, his eyes fixed on the road that remained stubbornly empty. He'd told himself he would go inside when the stars faded. He'd told himself he would rest. He'd told himself a lot of things that turned out to be lies. He heard Clara before he saw her. The soft pad of bare feet on the wooden floor, the creak of the door, and then she was beside him, still in the thin cotton shift she'd been sleeping in, her hair tangled and her eyes already sharp. She didn't say good morning. She just sat down on the step beside him and looked out at the road the same way he had been doing. "You didn't sleep," she said. "I got some." "You're lying again." Jack almost smiled. "You're starting to sound like Eli." "Eli's smart." She pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. The shift rode up past her ankles, and Jack noticed for the first time how thin her legs still were. The soup and bread had filled her stomach, but her body had a long way to go before it caught up to what it should have been. "He's also worried. I can tell." "We're all worried, Clara. That's what happens when something important is at stake." She considered this. "What's at stake? Me and Benny?" "Yes." She nodded slowly, as if she were logging this information into a mental file. "I figured. That's why I'm not going to be a problem. Whatever you need me to do, I'll do it. If you tell me to hide, I'll hide. If you tell me to run, I'll run. If you tell me to be quiet, I won't make a sound." Jack turned to look at her. She was staring straight ahead, her small face set in an expression that was too old for her features, too hard for her years. "That's not something you should have to think about," he said. "But I do think about it." She looked at him then, and her eyes were flat and clear. "I've been thinking about it since Mama left. I'm all Benny's got." "I have to think about it. You're not all he's got anymore." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked back at the road. "I know. That's why I can sit here instead of watching by myself." Jack felt something crack open in his chest. A seam he hadn't known was there. He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything adequate to say. He just sat beside her on the step, both of them facing the east road, waiting together. Inside the house, Eli woke and started the fire in the stove. Benjamin began to fuss, and Clara went in to feed him before he worked himself up into a full cry. Jack stayed on the porch, listening to the sounds of the house coming to life. Eli's footsteps, Clara's low voice murmuring to the baby, the clank of the coffee pot being set on the stove. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a family starting its day. He wanted to believe they could keep having mornings like this. The first sign that something was wrong came just after breakfast. Eli had gone to the barn to check on the horses, and Clara was in the front room with Benjamin, and Jack was cleaning the breakfast dishes when he heard the sound of hooves on the east road. Not one horse, several. Moving at a pace that was deliberate but not urgent. He dried his hands on his apron, took it off, and walked to the front door. 4 riders came over the rise and down the lane toward the ranch. The lead horse was familiar, the gray, the silver mane, the rider with his erect posture and his hands resting easy on the reins. Judge Henry Voss had come back. Behind him rode 3 men Jack didn't recognize. One of them was carrying a leather satchel. Another was thin and sharp-featured, with the look of a man who made his living with a pen instead of his hands. The third was broad and silent, the same type as the men Voss had brought the first time, hired presence, meant to intimidate. Jack did not move from the porch. Voss pulled up at the gate and dismounted with the same unhurried ease as before. He handed his reins to the broad man and walked forward, stopping at the gate. He did not open it. "Mr. Harper," he said, "I trust you've had time to reflect on our previous conversation." "No," Jack said. "I've had time to get a lawyer and a marshal." Voss's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, I'm aware of your communications. I'm also aware that your marshal is not here yet, and your lawyer is still in Abilene. In the meantime, I have obtained a document that I believe you'll want to see." He gestured to the thin man, who stepped forward and pulled a folded paper from inside his coat. Jack didn't reach for it. "What is it?" "It's a medical affidavit from Dr. Elias Pritchard, duly licensed physician of Caldwell County, attesting to the urgent medical needs of the infant Benjamin Dunn and the unsuitability of your household for meeting those needs." Voss held the paper up, letting it catch the gray light. "I have also obtained a supplemental order from Magistrate Dills, signed this morning, granting temporary custody of the Dunn children to the county, pending a full assessment." Jack felt his blood go cold, but he kept his face still. "Dills signed it?" "He did. After reviewing the medical evidence, he concluded that the children's welfare required immediate intervention." "Let me see it." Voss handed the paper to the thin man, who walked to the gate and held it out. Jack took it. He read it once, then again. The language was precise, legal, filled with the kind of terminology that made simple things sound complicated. But the meaning was clear. Clara and Benjamin were to be removed from his care and placed in the county system, effective immediately. "This is a lie," Jack said, looking up. "Benjamin hasn't seen a doctor. There's been no examination. The affidavit was based on Dr. Pritchard's review of the children's condition as described by reliable witnesses," Voss said smoothly. "Given the urgency of the situation, physical examination was deemed unnecessary. The law requires an examination. The law requires medical documentation. The judge has accepted this as sufficient. If you wish to challenge it, you may do so in court. But that process takes weeks, and in the meantime, the children remain in county custody." Jack stood very still. The paper in his hand felt like a weight that was trying to pull him down into the ground. He thought about Clara in the front room, holding Benjamin, humming that tuneless song. He thought about her hand on his sleeve in the hallway, asking him not to let them take Benny. "You're not taking them," Jack said. Voss's expression hardened. "Mr. Harper, defying a court order is a serious offense. I have 3 witnesses and a deputy waiting on the main road. If you refuse to comply, I will have you arrested for obstruction." "Then arrest me." The words came out flat, final. Jack folded the paper and held it out to the thin man, who took it back with a nervous glance at Voss. "I'm not going to fight you," Jack continued. "I'm not going to resist. But I'm not going to hand those children over either. You want them, you're going to have to come into my house and take them. And when you do, you'd better hope that marshal from Austin never arrives, because when he does, I'm going to tell him exactly what happened here today." Voss's jaw worked. For the first time, the mask of pleasant command slipped, and Jack saw the anger underneath. Not hot, not impulsive, but cold and patient and deep. "You're making a mistake," Voss said quietly. "I've made a lot of mistakes," Jack said. "This isn't one of them." Voss held his gaze for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to his horse. He mounted without looking back. "You have 24 hours, he said from the saddle. "I'll be back tomorrow with the sheriff and a formal eviction order. By this time tomorrow, those children will be in county custody, and you will be in a cell. I suggest you use the time wisely." He pulled the horse around and rode out, the 3 men following. Jack watched them go, his hands opening and closing at his sides. When they were gone, he turned and went inside. Clara was in the hallway. She had heard everything. "Are you going to be arrested?" she asked. "Not if we leave before they come back." She didn't flinch. "When?" "Now. Get your things, what little you have. Tell Eli to saddle the horses. I'll get the wagon ready." She turned without a word and went to find Eli. Jack stood in the hallway for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest, and then he moved. The next hour was a blur of motion. Jack hitched the wagon while Eli saddled the 2 riding horses. Clara packed the few belongings she and Benjamin had acquired, the blanket Caroline had given them, the extra cloths for feeding, the small wooden horse that Eli had carved for her the day before and left on her bed without comment. She packed them into a flour sack with the same precision she applied to everything, folding and arranging, making sure nothing was left behind. Benjamin, sensing the tension, began to cry. Clara picked him up and held him against her shoulder, patting his back, murmuring to him in that low, steady voice she used when the world got too big for him. "It's okay," she said. "We're going somewhere safe. Jack's got us." Jack came in from the barn and stopped when he saw her standing in the middle of the front room, the flour sack at her feet, Benjamin against her shoulder, her face calm and ready. "That's everything?" he asked. "That's everything." He looked at the sack, at the baby, at Clara, 4 years old, ready to leave everything behind again without a word of complaint or a moment of hesitation. She'd done it before, walking away from the blanket where her mama had left her, walking toward a town she'd never seen, carrying a baby she didn't know how to keep alive. She knew how to leave. She'd had too much practice. "All right," Jack said. "Let's go." They loaded the wagon with what they could carry: blankets, food, water, the jar of milk Caroline had brought. Eli tied the 2 riding horses to the back of the wagon, and Clara climbed into the bed with Benjamin in her arms. Jack took the reins, and Eli sat beside him on the bench. "Where are we going?" Eli asked. "North. My brother's place in the Panhandle. It's about a week's ride, maybe more with the wagon." "And if they follow us?" Jack looked at the road ahead. "Then we deal with that when it comes." He snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward. Behind them, the Harper ranch grew smaller and smaller in the gray morning light. Clara watched it from the wagon bed, her hand resting on Benjamin's back, her face unreadable. They had been at the ranch for 4 days. It was the longest she had stayed anywhere in her entire life. She watched until the roof disappeared behind a rise, and then she turned around and looked at the road ahead. Jack drove north, staying off the main road, following the wagon tracks that cut through the open range toward the rolling hills beyond. It was slower going, rougher on the wheels, but it meant they were less likely to be seen. The cloud cover held, muting the light and keeping the temperature cool, and the only sounds were the creak of the wagon, the jingle of the harness, and the occasional call of a meadowlark. They rode for 3 hours without stopping. Eli sat rigid beside his father, his eyes scanning the horizon. Clara sat in the wagon bed with Benjamin asleep across her legs, her back against a sack of flour, watching the sky. Around noon, Jack pulled the wagon into a shallow ravine, where a thin trickle of water ran over a bed of smooth stones. He let the horses drink and passed out dried meat and water to Eli and Clara. "We'll rest here for an hour," he said. "Then we push on until dark." Clara accepted the water without comment. She drank slowly, then wet the corner of her blanket and wiped Benjamin's face with it. He had woken up and was looking around with those wandering eyes, his fists opening and closing. "He's getting stronger," Eli said, watching her. Clara nodded. "He's not as floppy as he was. He holds his head up a little more. That's good. He's going to be just fine." She said it with such certainty that neither Jack nor Eli could think of anything to add. They ate their dried meat in silence, listening to the water and the wind. Jack was the first to hear it, a sound that didn't belong, distant, rhythmic, carrying across the open ground. He held up his hand, and Eli and Clara went still. Hooves. Coming from the south, fast. Jack moved to the edge of the ravine and looked out across the prairie. A single rider, pushing his horse hard, was coming toward them at a full gallop. He didn't recognize the horse or the rider at this distance, but the direction was wrong. The rider wasn't coming from Caldwell Flats. He was coming from the southwest, from the direction of Oak Crossing. Jack's hand went to the rifle he had propped against the wagon. "Stay here," he said. "Both of you. Don't move until I say." He climbed out of the ravine and walked toward the approaching rider, his rifle in his hands but not raised. As the rider got closer, he began to make out details: a dark coat, a worn hat, a face that was familiar in a way that made his heart lurch. It was Owen, but not the Owen he had seen the day before. This Owen looked like he had ridden through something terrible. He pulled his horse to a stop 10 yards from Jack and swung down. The horse was lathered, sides heaving, head drooping. Owen himself looked no better. His coat was torn, there was dried blood on his sleeve, and his eyes were wild in a way Jack had never seen from him. "Jack," Owen said, his voice hoarse, "we've got a problem." "What happened to you?" "Found Morgan, or what was left of him." Owen wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "He never made it to Caldwell Flats. Voss's men jumped him about 10 miles outside of Oak Crossing. Beat him, took the papers he was carrying, left him in a ditch." "Is he alive?" "Barely. I got him to a doctor in Oak Crossing, but he's not going to be traveling anywhere for weeks. The papers are gone, the summons, the official orders, everything. Voss has them now." Jack felt the ground shift under him. "So the marshal isn't coming." "The marshal is still coming, but without the summons, without the documentation that Morgan was carrying, there's nothing for him to serve. He'll arrive in Caldwell Flats with a warrant that's missing its supporting paperwork, and Voss will have time to destroy evidence, relocate children, cover his tracks." "How much time?" "Days, maybe a week. Long enough for Voss to make sure the ledger and the children it mentions can never be found." Jack stood in the grass, the wind moving around them, and tried to think. His mind was working, but every path forward seemed to lead to a dead end. "I was coming to warn you," Owen said. "When Voss realizes Morgan's been found and the papers are gone, he's going to accelerate his timeline. He won't wait 24 hours. He'll come for the children today." "He already did," Jack said, "this morning, with a custody order from Dills." Owen's face went pale. "He got Dills to sign?" "Medical affidavit. Fraudulent, but he's got it. He gave me 24 hours to comply. I told him I'd leave before I handed over the children. We were heading north, to my brother's place in the Panhandle." Owen looked at the wagon, at the 2 children in the ravine, at the road ahead. He was a lawman. He had spent his whole career working within the boundaries of statutes and procedures. But he also had a ledger in his cabinet back in Caldwell Flats that listed 43 children, 17 of whom had vanished from the record. And the man who had made them vanish was still out there. "Jack," Owen said slowly, "if you run, he wins. Not just with Clara and Benjamin, with all of them. Every child whose name is in that ledger, every family that's still waiting for word, every mother who surrendered her baby thinking she was doing the right thing, they all lose." "I know that." "If you stay, he'll arrest you. He'll take the children by force. And without Morgan's papers, the marshal won't be able to stop him in time." "I know that too." "So what are you going to do?" Jack looked at the wagon, at Clara, who had come to the edge of the ravine and was standing there with Benjamin in her arms, watching them with those steady, knowing eyes. "I'm going to do what I should have done from the start," Jack said. "I'm going to take the fight to him." Owen stared at him. "What are you talking about?" "Voss's strongbox is already in Marcus's hands, but there's more than just the ledger. There are names, witnesses, families, people who paid him off the books, people who were part of his network. If we can find them, if we can get them to talk before the marshal gets here, we can build a case that doesn't rely on Morgan's papers." "That's a long shot. Those people are scared." "Then we give them a reason not to be." Owen looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara, standing at the edge of the ravine, holding her brother. She was 4 years old, and she had already been asked to carry more than most people carried in a lifetime. She was being asked again, without anyone saying a word. "All right," Owen said. "What's the plan?" Jack turned and walked back to the wagon. He took the reins from Eli and looked down at Clara. "We're not running," he said. "We're going back to Caldwell Flats. We're going to find the people Voss is afraid of, and we're going to give them a reason to stand up. It's going to be dangerous. It's going to be hard, and I need to know if you're with me." Clara looked at him. She looked at Benjamin. Then she looked up at the gray sky, as if she were asking someone something that only she could hear. "I'm with you," she said. Jack nodded. He turned the wagon around and headed south, back toward Caldwell Flats. The wind picked up, and the first drops of rain began to fall. The rain came in earnest as they reached the edge of Caldwell Flats. Not a gentle shower, but a hard, slanted assault that turned the dirt streets into ribbons of mud and drove the few pedestrians under awnings and into doorways. Jack pulled the wagon down a side alley behind the Courier building, where Marcus Hale's printing press could be heard even through the storm, a rhythmic clanking that sounded like the heartbeat of the town. Marcus met them at the back door, his face creased with concern. He took in the soaked wagon, the tired horses, the two children huddled in the bed under a canvas tarp. His eyes landed on Owen's torn coat and the dried blood on his sleeve, and his expression shifted from concern to something harder. "Get inside," Marcus said. "All of you. We haven't got much time." They filed into the back room of the newspaper office, a cluttered space stacked with newsprint and ink barrels, and the smell of lead type. Marcus lit a lantern and hung it from a hook, casting a yellow glow over the room. Clara sat on a stack of newsprint with Benjamin in her lap, pulling the wet blanket tighter around him. Eli stood by the door, his back to the wall, his eyes moving across the windows. Marcus looked at Jack. "Voss knows you're back. We haven't been in town 10 minutes. He's got eyes everywhere. Boy named Teller, works at the livery, runs messages for him. Saw you turn onto the side street and went straight to the hotel." Marcus pulled a watch from his vest and checked it. "You've got maybe 15 minutes before he sends someone to find out what you're doing." Jack turned to Owen. "We need to move faster than I thought." Owen was already pulling a folded piece of paper from his inside coat pocket. He spread it on the work table, and Jack saw a list of names, addresses, and brief notations in Owen's tight handwriting. "These are the people who might talk," Owen said. "The ones I mentioned before. 2 of them are in town. The rest are scattered across the county." "How many in town?" "2. A woman named Hattie Parrish, who worked as a clerk in Voss's office for 6 months before she quit. She saw the off-the-books payments going in and out. And a man named Emmett Dooley, who ran a freight service Voss used to transport children to placement households. Dooley stopped working for him 3 years ago, and he's been drinking ever since." Jack scanned the list. "Which one is closer?" "Hattie lives on Willow Street, about 4 blocks east of here. Dooley stays at the boarding house on Front Street, but he's usually at the saloon by this hour." "Then we split up." Jack looked at Marcus. "Can you keep Clara and Eli and the baby here while we're gone?" Marcus nodded. "They'll be safe. I've got a cellar with a false wall. If anyone comes looking, they won't find them." Clara looked up from the newsprint stack. Her face was calm, but her eyes were fixed on Jack with that penetrating steadiness that made him feel like she could see right through him. "I want to go with you," she said. "Clara, I can help. People are more likely to talk to a little girl than to 2 men with guns." Owen let out a low breath. "She's not wrong." Jack crouched down in front of her. "If you come with me, you have to do exactly what I say. No arguing, no running off. And if I tell you to hide, you hide, and you don't come out until I come for you. Can you do that?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at Benjamin, who was asleep against her chest, and she made a decision that Jack could see passing across her face like a shadow. "Eli can hold Benny while I'm gone." It was the first time she had ever voluntarily handed her brother to someone else. Jack looked at Eli, who stepped forward without hesitation and held out his arms. Clara transferred Benjamin with the careful precision of a surgeon, making sure Eli had his head supported, making sure the blanket was tucked around him. "He's going to wake up in about an hour," she said. "He'll want to eat. The jar of milk is in the flour sack. You have to warm it a little first, but not too much. And don't let him lie flat after he eats. He spits up if you let him lie flat." Eli nodded. "I got it." Clara looked at him for a moment longer, then turned to Jack. "I'm ready." Jack looked at Owen. "You take Dooley. I'll take Hattie Parrish. We meet back here in 2 hours." Owen checked his revolver, then pulled his coat tight against the rain. 2 hours. If I'm not back by then, assume I'm in trouble." "Same." They went out into the rain, 2 men and a 4-year-old girl, splitting up at the mouth of the alley. Owen went left, toward the saloon on Front Street. Jack and Clara went right, toward Willow Street. The rain had thinned to a steady drizzle by the time they reached Hattie Parrish's house, a narrow frame building with a sagging porch and a window that glowed with the dim light of a single lamp. Jack knocked on the door, keeping Clara behind him, her small hand gripping his coat. The door opened a crack, held by a chain. A woman's voice, wary and thin. "Who is it?" Jack Harper. I own the ranch east of here. I need to talk to you about Henry Voss." The chain rattled. The door opened wider, and Hattie Parrish looked out at them. She was maybe 40, with tired eyes and iron-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a faded house dress and held a candle in one hand, and she looked at Jack with the expression of someone who has been expecting bad news for a very long time. "I don't talk about Henry Voss," she said. "I know, but I've got something you need to see." Jack reached inside his coat and pulled out one of Marcus's copies of the ledger. He unfolded it and held it up so she could see the entries. Hattie's eyes went wide. She stared at the paper, then at Jack, then at Clara, who had stepped out from behind him and was looking up at her with those steady, knowing eyes. "Where did you get that?" Hattie whispered. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that Voss knows it's gone, and he's trying to cover his tracks. He's got a custody order for those children," Jack gestured to Clara, "and he's going to put them in his system. I need someone to testify about what you saw in his office. Not in court, just to a United States Marshal who's on his way from Austin. Give him enough to open a full investigation, and Voss will never touch another child." Hattie looked at Clara again. The little girl stared back, unblinking. "How old are you?" Hattie asked. 4, Clara said. "And that baby you had, where is he now?" "With Eli, at the newspaper office. He's safe." Hattie's face crumpled. She pressed a hand to her mouth and stood there in the doorway, the rain dripping off the eaves behind her, the candle flickering in her hand. "I have a daughter," she said finally. Her voice was barely audible. "She was 6 when my husband died. I couldn't afford to keep her. Voss said he would place her with a good family. He said she would have a better life." She lowered her hand. "That was 5 years ago. I haven't seen her since. He won't tell me where she went. He says the records are sealed." Jack felt Clara's hand tighten on his coat. "If you talk to the marshal," Jack said, "if you tell him what you saw, we can open those records." Hattie looked at the ledger copy again. Then she looked at Clara, standing in the rain, barefoot, holding the sleeve of a man she had met only days ago. "Come in," Hattie said. "Both of you." They sat at her kitchen table while the rain drummed on the roof. Clara sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, listening to every word. Hattie talked for almost an hour, her voice shaking at first, then growing steadier as she described the payments she had recorded, the names she had memorized, the children she had watched being led into carriages and wagons and driven away. She had kept copies of some of the records, hidden in a false bottom of her sewing box. She brought them out, yellowed and fragile, and spread them on the table. "There's more," she said, "but I was too afraid to take them. He would have known. He would have." She stopped, her eyes going to Clara. "He would have hurt my daughter." "Where is your daughter now?" Clara asked. Hattie shook her head. "I don't know. After I quit, he stopped answering my letters. He said if I kept asking, he would make sure I never saw her again." Clara looked at the papers on the table. Then she reached out and put her small hand on top of Hattie's. "We'll find her," Clara said. "Jack's good at finding people." Hattie looked at the little girl, and for the first time since they had arrived, a tear slipped down her cheek. "I hope you're right," she whispered. Jack gathered the papers and stood. "I need to get back to Marcus's. We've got 2 hours before Voss starts looking for us in earnest. Will you come with us? There's a marshal coming. If you're there when he arrives, you can give your statement directly." Hattie looked at her kitchen, at the single lamp, at the life she had built in the shadow of her fear. Then she looked at Clara. "Yes," she said, "I'll come." They walked back through the rain, Hattie carrying a small bag with her sewing box inside. Clara held Jack's hand, and the street was empty, and the only sound was the hiss of water on dirt. When they reached the Courier building, Owen was already there. He was standing in the back room with Marcus, his face grim, a bottle of whiskey on the table beside him that he had not touched. "Dooley's dead," Owen said. The words landed like a blow. Jack set down the papers and looked at Owen. "How?" "Found him in his room at the boarding house. Someone got to him before I did. Slit his throat, made it look like a robbery. Took his wallet, scattered his things. But it wasn't a robbery. Dooley hasn't had $2 to his name in 3 years. Owen's voice was flat, controlled. "Voss is cleaning house." Jack looked at the papers from Hattie's sewing box, then at the ledger copies Marcus had printed. They had evidence. They had witnesses. But every hour they waited, Voss was cutting the threads that held the case together. "How many people on your list are still alive?" Jack asked. Owen didn't answer immediately. He reached into his coat and pulled out the folded paper with the names, and he looked at it for a long moment. "3," he said, "including Hattie. The others are scattered too far to reach before Voss gets to them. And now that Dooley's gone, we've lost our best chance at connecting Voss to the actual transport of the children." Clara had moved to the corner where Eli was sitting with Benjamin. She took the baby from her brother's arms and held him close, checking his breathing, his color, the little rise and fall of his chest. She did it without thinking, a motion as automatic as breathing. "Jack," she said. He turned. "Benny's warm." He crossed the room and crouched beside her. Benjamin's face was flushed, his forehead hot to the touch. His breathing was faster than it should have been, and his eyes were half closed, not in sleep, but in something closer to exhaustion. "He's been like this for about 20 minutes, Eli said. "I didn't want to say anything because you were busy, but he started feeling warm right after you left." Jack touched the baby's cheek. Benjamin whimpered, but didn't open his eyes fully. "We need a doctor," Jack said. "There's no doctor in Caldwell Flats," Owen said. "Not a real one. Pritchard is the closest thing, and he's in Voss's pocket." "There's a woman in Oak Crossing," Hattie said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. "A midwife named Martha Crane. She's delivered half the babies in this county. She's not a physician, but she knows more about sick infants than any doctor I've ever met." "How far to Oak Crossing?" 4 hours by wagon. Maybe 3 if you push the horses." Jack looked at Benjamin. The baby's color was getting worse, a gray undertone creeping into the flush. He thought about what Clara had said, how Benjamin had gone quiet before, how the quiet was worse than the crying. "I'll take him," Jack said. "Owen, you stay here with Hattie and the papers. Keep them safe. Wait for the marshal." "I'm coming with you," Clara said. "Clara, he's my brother. I'm coming with you." Her voice was flat, unyielding. She was not asking. Jack looked at her, at the baby in her arms, and saw the same expression she had worn in the market when she had held out her hand to strangers. She would not be left behind. She would not be separated from Benjamin again. "All right," he said. "Eli, you stay with Owen." "I want to come," Eli said. "I need you here. Someone has to watch the horses and keep an eye on the back street. Besides, if Voss's men come looking, you're the one who knows how to move quiet." Eli's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Marcus spoke up. "I've got a fast horse in the back, a mare, not a wagon horse. She'll get you to Oak Crossing in 2.5 hours if you ride light." "Can you ride, Clara?" She looked at the horse, a lean bay with a white star on her forehead. "I can hang on." Jack saddled the mare while Marcus packed a small bag with food and water. Clara wrapped Benjamin in 2 blankets, securing him against her chest with a length of rope so her hands would be free. She did it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had carried a baby for miles before. Jack lifted her onto the horse, then mounted behind her, settling her between his arms. She leaned back against his chest, one hand on Benjamin's back, the other gripping the saddle horn. "You ready?" Jack asked. "Yes." He touched his heels to the mare's sides, and they moved out into the rain. The road to Oak Crossing was a winding track that followed the low ground between ridges, avoiding the open prairie where they could be seen from miles away. Jack pushed the mare as fast as he dared, feeling her strength and her willingness, the way she responded to every shift of his weight. Clara sat perfectly still in front of him, her small body tense but not trembling, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Benjamin's breathing was a constant presence between them, shallow and fast. And every few minutes Clara would tilt her head to listen, checking, always checking. "He's still breathing," she said at one point, as if she needed to say it out loud. "He's a fighter," Jack said. She didn't reply. She just held her brother closer. They had been riding for about an hour when the rain stopped and the clouds began to break. The moon appeared through the gaps, silvering the wet ground, casting long shadows across the road. Jack took it as a good sign, but he didn't slow the pace. They were halfway to Oak Crossing when Clara spoke again. "Jack?" "Yeah." "What if he doesn't make it?" The question hung in the air, raw and unguarded in a way that Clara rarely allowed herself to be. He's going to make it. But what if he doesn't? Jack thought about how to answer. He thought about the market, about the tiny cracked lips pulling at the wet cloth, about the way Benjamin's fingers had curled around nothing and held on. He thought about Clara, 4 years old, carrying her brother across miles of empty country because there was no one else to do it. Then he'll go knowing his sister never gave up on him. That's more than most people ever get. Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she leaned her head back against Jack's chest and closed her eyes. They found Martha Crane's house on the edge of Oak Crossing just before midnight. It was a small cabin with a dome in the window and a windmill creaking in the yard. Jack dismounted, lifted Clara down, and carried her and the baby to the door. Martha Crane opened it before he could knock. She was a tall woman in her 60s with gray braids and hands that looked strong enough to wring a chicken's neck. She took one look at Benjamin and reached for him. "Get inside," she said. "Both of you. Don't track mud on my floor." She laid Benjamin on a table near the stove, where a fire was burning low. She stripped off his blankets, felt his forehead, listened to his chest with a hollow tube of wood pressed to her ear. Her hands moved quickly, competently, without hesitation. "How long has he been like this?" she asked. "A few hours," Jack said. "Maybe 4. "He was fine this morning. Was he cold before he got hot?" "I don't know. Clara, was he cold?" Clara stepped forward, her voice steady. "He was cold when we left the ranch yesterday. I wrapped him up, but he shivered for a while. Then he got warm, and I thought that meant he was better." Martha looked at her, really looked at her, and something passed between them that Jack couldn't name. "How old are you, child?" 4. "And this is your brother?" "Yes." Martha's hands paused for just a moment over Benjamin's chest. Then she resumed her examination. "It's a lung fever," she said, "common enough in infants. The cold weakened him, and he couldn't fight it off. He's small, and he's been through a lot, and his body is using everything it has just to breathe." She straightened up and looked at Jack. "I've seen babies this size die from a simple cold. I've also seen them pull through. It depends on how much fight he's got in him." "He's got plenty," Clara said. Martha looked at her again. Then she nodded. "We'll treat him with steam and willow bark and around-the-clock feeding. If he makes it through the next 48 hours, he'll likely recover." She pointed to a narrow bed in the corner. "You can sleep there, child. I'll watch your brother." "I'm not sleeping." "You will if you want to be any use to him tomorrow. You can't help him if you're too exhausted to stand." Martha's voice was firm but not unkind. "I've been doing this for 40 years. I know what I'm doing." Clara looked at Benjamin, then at the bed, then at Jack. "It's okay," Jack said. "I'll stay with him." She hesitated. Then she walked to the bed, climbed onto it without removing her shoes, and lay down facing the table where Benjamin lay under Martha's hands. Her eyes stayed open for a long time, fixed on her brother's face. But eventually, the exhaustion that had been building for days, for weeks, for her entire short life, pulled her under. Jack sat in the chair beside the stove, watching Martha work, watching Benjamin breathe. The fire crackled. The windmill creaked. And somewhere behind him, the woman from the newspaper office was sitting in a back room with a stack of papers that could bring down a county magistrate, if anyone lived long enough to read them. He thought about Eli, alone in Caldwell Flats with Owen and Hattie, and a printing press that had already changed everything. He thought about the marshal, somewhere on the road between Austin and this broken country. He thought about Henry Voss, who was probably sitting in a hotel room right now, calculating his next move. And he thought about the 4-year-old girl asleep in the corner, who had carried a baby across miles of dust and rain and fear, and who was still carrying him, even in her dreams. The clock on Martha's shelf ticked past midnight. Benjamin's breathing was still shallow, still fast. But it was steady, and for now, that was enough to hold on to. The dawn came gray and quiet through the windows of Martha Crane's cabin, carrying the smell of wet earth and wood smoke. Jack had not moved from the chair beside the stove. His back ached and his eyes burned, but he had watched every breath Benjamin had taken through the long night. The shallow ones, the fast ones, the ones that had paused just long enough to send a spike of fear through his chest before resuming. Martha had stayed up with him, dozing in her rocker, waking every hour to check the baby's temperature and listen to his chest with her wooden tube. She had said nothing encouraging and nothing discouraging. She had simply worked, steady and silent, the way people do when they have seen too much to waste words on hope or despair. Now the fire was burning low, and Benjamin's breathing had changed. It was still fast, but it was deeper. The rattling quality that had worried Jack the most was fading. Martha leaned over the table, pressed her ear to the baby's chest for a long moment, then straightened up. She looked at Jack with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was close to one. "He's turned the corner," she said. "The fever's breaking. He'll be weak for a week, maybe more, but he's going to live." Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. He looked at Benjamin, whose face had lost that gray undertone and was slowly returning to something closer to pink. The baby's eyes were closed, but his lips were no longer cracked and dry. He looked peaceful in a way he hadn't since the night they had arrived at the ranch. "Can I tell Clara?" Jack asked. "She's already awake." Jack turned. Clara was sitting up in the narrow bed, her hair tangled, her eyes fixed on Benjamin. She had not made a sound, but she was watching them with that focused intensity that Jack had come to know. She met his eyes, and something in her face shifted, a crack in the armor she wore so constantly. "Is he okay?" she asked. "He's going to be okay," Jack said. "Martha says he's turned the corner." Clara slid off the bed and walked to the table. She stood on her toes and looked at Benjamin's face. She reached out and touched his cheek with the back of her fingers, the way she had done 100 times before, checking, always checking. Then she pressed her forehead gently against his and stayed there for a long moment. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet, but she did not cry. She simply nodded, as if confirming something she had already known. "I told you," she said quietly. "He's a fighter." Martha watched the exchange without comment. Then she busied herself at the stove, heating a pot of broth and setting out cups. "You'll need to stay here another day at least," Martha said. "The baby needs rest and steady feeding. He's not strong enough to travel yet." Jack looked at the window. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still heavy, and the road would be mud. He thought about Caldwell Flats, about Owen and Hattie and Marcus, about the marshal who was supposed to arrive. He had no way of knowing what was happening there. "How long before he could travel?" Jack asked. "A full day, maybe 2, and even then you'd need to go slow and keep him warm and dry." Jack looked at Clara. She had climbed onto the chair beside the table and was holding Benjamin's hand, her thumb moving in slow circles across his tiny fingers. "Clara," Jack said, "I need to go back to Caldwell Flats. The marshal might be there by now. Owen needs me, but I can't take Benjamin on the road in his condition." She looked up at him. Her face had gone still again, the armor back in place. "You want to leave us here?" "I don't want to, but I think I have to. Martha will take care of you. She knows what she's doing. And as soon as Benjamin is strong enough, I'll come back for you, or I'll send word." Clara looked at Martha, who was stirring the broth with her back to them. Then she looked at Jack again. "How long?" "A day, maybe 2. I'll come back as fast as I can." She considered this. Her hand never stopped moving on Benjamin's fingers. "Okay," she said, "but if you're not back in 3 days, I'm going to walk to Caldwell Flats and find you." Jack felt the corner of his mouth twitch. "I know you would." "Then we understand each other." Martha turned from the stove, holding a cup of broth. She handed it to Clara, who took it without looking away from Jack. "You'd better get going," Martha said. "If you're going to make it back before dark, you need to leave now. And take some food for the road. You look like you haven't eaten in a day." Jack stood, stretched his aching back, and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the latch and looked back at Clara. She was feeding Benjamin with a tiny spoon, her movements precise and careful, her whole attention focused on the baby in her arms. He wanted to say something. He wanted to tell her that she was the bravest person he had ever met, that he would move heaven and earth to come back for her, that she and Benjamin had changed something in him that he hadn't even known was broken. But the words wouldn't come in the right order, and she was busy, and the road was waiting. He opened the door and stepped out into the gray morning. The ride back to Caldwell Flats was harder than the ride out. The rain had turned the road to a treacherous slick of mud, and Jack had to push the mare hard to make up for the slow going. His mind was working the whole time, running through scenarios, preparing for what he might find. He reached the edge of town just past noon. The streets were quiet, too quiet. The usual traffic of wagons and horses was absent, and the few people he saw were moving quickly, heads down, as if they wanted to be indoors. He rode straight to the Courier building and went in through the back. Marcus was at his press, but he stopped when he saw Jack. His face was drawn, and there was ink on his hands, and a look in his eyes that Jack didn't like. "Owen's in the back room," Marcus said. "He's been waiting for you." Jack walked through the narrow hallway and pushed open the door to the back room. Owen was sitting at the table, a cup of cold coffee in front of him. Hattie was there too, her sewing box on her lap, her face pale. Eli was standing by the window, watching the street. "Pa," Eli said, and the relief in his voice was plain. Jack looked at Owen. "What happened?" Owen set down the cup. "Marshal Calhoun arrived this morning. He's at the sheriff's office now, reviewing the evidence. He says the ledger and Hattie's testimony are enough to open a formal investigation, but without Morgan's original summons, he can't make an arrest on the spot. He needs to send to Austin for new paperwork. That'll take another 3 days. And Voss? Gone. He left town last night, right after you rode out, packed his things at the hotel, paid his bill, and disappeared. His men are gone too. He could be anywhere." "He could be, but I think I know where." Owen reached into his coat and pulled out a folded map. He spread it on the table and pointed to a spot about 20 miles east of Caldwell Flats. "There's a property out here, a farm that belonged to a man named Silas Granger. Granger died 2 years ago, but the deed was transferred to a holding company that we now know is owned by Voss through a series of shell titles. It's the only property he controls that's not in the county records. If he's got a bolt hole, that's it." Jack studied the map. "If we go after him, we need legal backing. We can't just ride in and drag him out. We've got a federal marshal who's already seen the evidence. If we can show him that Voss is actively fleeing, he might authorize a pursuit." "Show him how?" Owen looked at Hattie. She opened her sewing box and pulled out a small leather notebook, worn and stained, tied with a string. "He kept a personal journal," Hattie said. "I took it from his office the day I quit. I've never told anyone. I was saving it in case I ever needed to bargain for information about my daughter." She handed it to Owen. He opened it, scanned a few pages, and looked up. "This is everything. Routes, contacts, payment schedules, and a map to the Granger property, with notes about a locked room in the cellar." Jack looked at the journal. Then he looked at Owen. "How fast can we get the marshal?" "He's at the sheriff's office now. I can have him here in 10 minutes. "Do it." Owen was gone before Jack finished the sentence. Jack turned to Eli. "I need you to stay here. Watch the street. If you see anyone who looks like one of Voss's men, you come find me. Don't engage. Don't try to stop them. Just find me." Eli nodded. "I can do that." Jack looked at Hattie. "You've been brave. Braver than most. When this is over, we're going to find your daughter. I promise you that." Hattie's eyes welled, but she held his gaze. "I believe you." The marshal arrived 8 minutes later. He was not what Jack had expected from a federal officer. Younger, leaner, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same hard wood as the country he served. He introduced himself simply as Calhoun, shook Jack's hand with a grip that was firm and brief, and sat down at the table to review the journal. He read for 5 minutes without speaking. Then he looked up. "This is sufficient," he said. "I'll authorize a pursuit and arrest warrant on the grounds of flight to avoid prosecution. But I need 2 men who know the terrain. I don't know this country." "I know it," Jack said, "and I've got a deputy who knows it better." "Get him. We ride in 1 hour." Jack found Owen outside, saddling his horse. Owen looked at him and didn't ask questions. "We're going after him," Jack said. "I figured. You don't have to come." Owen cinched the saddle tight and turned to face Jack. His face was tired, but his eyes were steady. "I've been waiting 8 years to see Henry Voss answer for what he's done. I'm not missing the ending." They rode out together, Marshal Calhoun on a government horse, Owen on his bay mare, Jack on the mare he'd borrowed from Marcus. The sky had cleared, and the sun was out, but the ground was still wet, and the air carried the smell of damp grass and distant rain. They made good time, pushing the horses at a steady trot, following the route marked in Voss's journal. The Granger property was a cluster of weathered buildings at the end of a long, rutted lane, surrounded by fields that had gone to seed. There were no horses in the paddock, no smoke from the chimney. It looked abandoned. But as they approached, Jack saw the tracks, fresh hoofprints in the mud leading around the back of the main house. Calhoun drew his revolver and held it low at his side. "Spread out. Owen, take the left. Jack, you come with me. We go in through the front." They moved forward in silence. The house had a sagging porch and boarded-up windows, but the front door was closed, not locked. Jack tried the latch, and it gave. He pushed the door open. The inside was dark and musty, but there were signs of recent habitation. A lamp with warm oil, a half-eaten meal on the table, a coat hung on the back of a chair. Then they heard the sound, a low, muffled cry, coming from beneath the floorboards. Calhoun's eyes met Jack's. Cellar. They found the trapdoor in the kitchen, hidden under a worn rug. Jack lifted it, and Calhoun went down first, his revolver raised, his boots landing on packed earth. The cellar was small and damp, lit only by the light from the trapdoor. And in the corner, bound to a chair, was a woman. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair and a bruise spreading across her cheek. She looked at them with terrified eyes. Calhoun holstered his revolver and crouched beside her. "We're federal officers. You're safe now. Who are you?" The woman's voice was hoarse, as if she had been crying for a long time. "My name is Sarah Granger. He killed my father. He took this property. And he said if I told anyone, he would come back for me." Jack felt the cold settle deeper into his bones. "Where is he now?" "He left this morning. Said he was heading for the border. He took a horse and a pack and told me if anyone came looking, I was to say I'd never seen him." Calhoun was already moving back toward the stairs. "How long ago?" 3 hours, maybe 4. Calhoun looked at Jack. "We can still catch him if we push hard. The border crossing at Red Fork is a day's ride. He'll have to stop to rest the horse." Jack looked at the woman, at the bonds on her wrists, at the bruise on her face. He thought about Clara, waiting at Martha's cabin. He thought about the children in the ledger, the ones who had disappeared, the ones who had never been found. He thought about Henry Voss, riding toward freedom. "Let's go," Jack said. They rode out of the Granger property at a gallop, following the tracks that led east, toward the rising sun and the distant line of the Red Fork crossing. The horses were tired, but Jack pushed them anyway, because the gap was closing. And every minute gave Voss another mile, and Jack was not going to let him have that mile. They rode for 2 hours without stopping. The tracks were clear in the mud, easy to follow, and they gained ground steadily. Then the tracks split. Owen pulled up and stared at the fork in the road. "He's trying to confuse us." "Which way?" Calhoun asked. Jack dismounted and studied the tracks. Both sets looked fresh. Both sets were heading east, but one set was heavier, weighted down with a pack. The other was lighter, faster. "Owen," Jack said, "you've ridden this country longer than me. Which way does he go if he wants to reach the border fastest?" "The left fork. Shorter, but it crosses open country. He'd be exposed." "Then he'd take the right fork. Stay under cover." Owen nodded. "That's what I'd do." "Then let's go." They took the right fork, and within a mile, the tracks began to look fresher, the edges of the hoofprints still sharp in the drying mud. They were gaining. They rounded a bend in the road, and there he was. Henry Voss sat on a gray horse about 100 yards ahead, his pack tied behind him, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He heard them coming and looked back. For a moment, he simply stared, as if he could not believe they had followed him this far. Then he kicked his horse and rode. The chase was short and brutal. Voss's horse was tired, and he was not a man accustomed to riding for his life. Within half a mile, Jack had closed the gap to 50 yards. Within a mile, to 30. Voss turned in the saddle and pulled a revolver from his coat. He fired once, wild, the shot going wide. He fired again, and Jack heard the bullet clip the air past his ear. Then Voss's horse stumbled, recovering, stumbling again, and Voss was thrown forward, his revolver spinning into the mud. He hit the ground hard and rolled, coming up on his knees, his face twisted with fury and fear. Jack dismounted before the mare had stopped moving. He crossed the distance in 4 strides, grabbed Voss by the collar, and pulled him to his feet. "It's over," Jack said. Voss's eyes were wild, searching for an escape that wasn't there. "You don't understand what you've done. The people I answer to, they won't let this stand. You've signed your own death warrant, Harper. I'll take my chances." Calhoun arrived a moment later, his revolver drawn. He looked at Voss with the cold assessment of a man who had seen too many men like him to be impressed. "Henry Voss," Calhoun said, "you are under arrest on federal charges of fraud, bribery, child trafficking, and flight to avoid prosecution. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you exercise it." He pulled Voss's arms behind his back and cuffed him. Voss said nothing. The fury in his eyes had been replaced by something else, a flat, hollow acceptance that Jack recognized as the look of a man who had finally run out of road. They rode back to Caldwell Flats in silence, Voss on Owen's horse with his hands cuffed to the saddle horn, Calhoun leading the animal, Jack and Owen riding flank. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the prairie, and the air had turned cold. They reached town just after dark. A small crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office, people who had heard the news, who had come to see with their own eyes that Henry Voss was finally in chains. Jack watched them watch Voss. He saw relief on some faces, anger on others, and on a few, something that looked like shame. The shame of having looked away. The shame of having known and done nothing.